January 29th, 2018. It is 7:09 p.m. The first item on our agenda this evening is South Shore Industrial Park Trust, 4 Pond Park. It's site plan review under section 1G and 1I in conjunction with special permit A3 parking waivers under section 5A of the zoning bylaw and such other relief as necessary to allow a re-tenanting with associated drainage and accessibility improvements to the existing building in the industrial park and South Hingham Development Overlay District. Thank you, welcome. I think the way we'll start tonight is we will hear from the applicant. We would like for you to present what you're doing and what waivers or what needs to be considered in our analysis, and then we will go from there. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Rich Field. Madam Chair, members of the board, Mary. On behalf, I'm president of A.W. Perry, also a trustee of the applicant South Shore Industrial Park Trust. And our team here tonight, Gabe Crocker of CHA, our civil engineer, Steve LaRocque, LaRocque Architecture and Planning, the architect on the project, Joe DiPasquale, who runs the South Shore portfolio, and also Scott Arnold with CHA as well. But I thought I'd just briefly provide a little bit of background on the property before I turn it over to Gabe. 4 Pond Park Road was built by A.W. Perry in 1980 as a regional headquarters for the Commerce Insurance Company. Upon their vacancy of the property, we put it into a multi-tenanted office building, which it remained for a few decades. We, A.W. Perry, had our South Shore office there up until late 2015. We were the last tenant in the building. We moved out and relocated to another spot in South Shore Park, and since that time, the building has been vacant. We've been attempting to market it to an office user. Originally, when we moved out in late 2015, we did look to keep it in its existing condition as a multi-tenanted office property, but the property was very chopped up. It was divided up in a difficult way to market effectively. So subsequently, we gutted the building. So it's all, right now, it's all down to bare walls. So it's completely open on every floor. And again, we took it to market trying to find either a full building user or single tenant users that we could put 3 separate tenants in the property. Unfortunately, the dated nature of the property, there really have been no substantial upgrades to it since its construction in 1980. We found it difficult to market. Tenants had a difficult time envisioning what it would look like. We found the South Hingham market for office space to be extremely competitive. The Derby Street corridor, in essence, has 0 vacancy for office tenants up and down there. And throughout our South Shore portfolio, we own some office buildings in other towns. We have found that the Hingham address is extremely attractive to office tenants. So our goal is to bring the property back online, consistent with its constructed use, but really to deliver a clean white box to the market that we hope will be successful in filling with an office tenant. So to provide a little more detail on our plan, I'm going to turn it over to Gabe.
Good evening, Gabe Crocker with CHA. With me is Scott Arnold. So here's the property to orient you. This is Industrial Park Road at the confluence of Pond Park Road here, and then Derby Street would be here, and Route 3 would be here. Property immediately adjacent to it is the 2 Pond Park, the Bone and the Bone and Muscle Center. So it's an existing. It's really a unique property. It's very wooded, and the building at the time was really designed to fit in amongst the ledge and the woods. and as part of that, it's unique in that the first floor, where you actually come in on the first floor here, this ground actually slopes down to a floor below so that light can get in the lower level through there. So there's actually a pedestrian bridge angled here that actually connects you, folks who park in the parking lot, across to the front door on the first floor. So as part of the building, proposed building renovation, and with us is Steve LaRocque of LaRocque Architecture, who's got can fill you in on the building, which is far more fun than what I do. But This stuff always looks better. But he's proposed a complete renovation of the building itself. So we took a look at what improvements could we make on the site as part of that would help improve the property and attract tenants. So one of the main things that we needed to do is replace this pedestrian bridge. It's dilapidated, and literally pieces of it are coming apart. The concrete's spalling and falling. But it was at an odd angle, and it was tilted, so it didn't in any way comply with ADA. So Steve and us worked together on a design that would get rid of the angled connection and provide a new, cleaner walkway arrangement with a direct ramp connection up into the building, which we took to the state ADA to get approved, and we do have the approval for that. And so that'll be a big improvement, because now the pedestrian connection will make sense at the front of the building. We're also improving pedestrian connectivity and access along the rear by redoing the sidewalk and the stairs that are back here today. It's very tight up against the building, so we were making some room down below just to pull it off and make room for the building downspouts, et cetera, that are back there. And then the parking lot itself, it's really built into the topography and the landscape. So you'll see that there's a drive-in, there's a parking field, essentially circular parking field here, and then there's a dead-end lot down here where these stalls are facing out toward the highway. So one of the first things we did was to lay out a proposed striping plan. There isn't, the markings have since faded away. So we laid that out. That actually led us to thinking, and we actually got comments from the fire marshal about access and circulation. So, in the drive-in, it's actually originally this was the in and this was the out. But in thinking about it, we reversed the circulation. It seemed to make more sense to have the in, limit it to one-way circulation that we can sign and stripe, where folks will come past the front entrance of the building, and then they can interact with the parking field and then ultimately leave in that direction. So as part of doing that, we did have our traffic engineer do a site distance analysis, which we submitted for the record to show that the access points have plenty of visibility. In addition to the striping, we proposed quite a bit of signage in terms of stop signs, stop bars, one-ways, one-way do not enters, things of that nature to help better clarify the circulation pattern through the site. And then we ran the fire truck template through it for the fire marshal. One of the things that came up there is the new larger truck, the ladder truck, makes it through without a problem. The one place that the cab was coming over the edge of the pavement, the tires stayed on it, but the cab went over, was right along here. So we proposed adding the crushed granite edging along that to make sure there isn't any obstructions in his way for the cab. But we weren't proposing to add pavement and widen the drive. It really wasn't needed, but we wanted to make sure that we met the overhang request of his. We added a formal dumpster enclosure. We also identified a specific 10 by 20 loading space as required under the regulations. We're also we propose to replace the parking lot lighting with LED dark sky compliant fixtures. So just to really bring it up from that aspect of it. We did receive staff comments with some questions about opportunity to improve screening for vehicles, particularly for the vehicles here facing the street, and then whether there was any vehicle light spillage heading out toward the highway. The reality is, in this area, this is a large mound, so all of these are protected by the fact that the grade is up there. But there is a peak along this edge, so we did propose a double row of evergreens in order to fill in that corner. And then we also proposed similar along the front to have it as a hedgerow. We're struggling. There's a ton of vegetation and woods here. We wanted to address the car headlights, but we didn't necessarily want to kill the only glimpse of the building we really have. So we were trying to find that balance. I think those are the main improvements. We From a stormwater perspective, the site today is sheet flows mostly in this direction down to the wetland system that's here. So we did file a request for determination of applicability with Concom, so we'll be in front of them next week. Since it all sheet flows down, there's a low spot with two little swale connections right here that come down the slope to discharge that stormwater to here, and that's starting to erode. So it was a perfect opportunity to not reinvent the wheel, but we can put catch basins and a new water quality unit right where the water all collects, and then have that get treated before it discharges and then we can close the curb and prevent that runoff situation from happening and improve water quality. So our initial meetings with Concom, that went over well, and like I said, we'll be in front of them for the RDA next week. I think that's it on my end. Sure.
Would you like to hear the architectural elements?
I think if it's helpful, I think that might, yeah,
Yeah.
sure.
Sure.
Here you go.
Hi, I'm Steve LaRock, an architect and a planner. The major elements of the structure that are being reworked are the exterior skin, including new curtain walls on the front facade. We're doing new cores. So right now, if you walked into the building, you'd see these remnants of plumbing just sort of sticking up. We're basically redesigning the core on each of the floors, and they're very similar. They almost match each other. Presently, the building has almost like a 1980s esque glazing system with an EFIS panel. We're gonna replace all that. So the entire shell of the building, with the exception of the masonry. The masonry is going to be repointed selectively, but other than the masonry, everything is going to be new. The punched windows, the roof, we're putting new HVAC systems in the building. This was sort of just to sort of expand a little bit on the grading issues that Gabe had mentioned. You can see in the elevation dotted. Everything above grade in the street is colored. Everything below is sort of dotted. So you can see the extent to which the building sort of nestles its way into the ledge. Interestingly, and just to expand just a tad, sorry about that, Gabe.
No problem. Just throw my stuff aside.
Really, just to expand a little bit on the grade difference that Gabe had mentioned. This is a section through the entrance and the entrance bridge. And you can see, this is the, we actually went to the Mass Architectural Access Board and got a variance from the requirements of MAB. But you can see the elevation changes, the overall section of the building. Building's approximately 27, 28 feet above grade, existing from the street grade up, but it nestles itself well into the ledge and into the grade.
That'll be office space down there, right?
Pardon me?
That'll be office space down there on that lower?
Yes, and I'll show you a plan real quickly. In fact, what I did, I brought some goodies here, but I have the architectural plan itself that's being developed as part of the working drawings. This kind of shows you the new. By the way, the reason we needed a variance from the Access Board is that even though we're providing 90% compliant elements of that ramp, the slope itself, because we were trying to maintain the existing grade as much as possible, the slope itself is a little extreme relative. It's 1 in 9 rather than being, the 1 in 12, and that was allowed by the Access Board. So what you see here is, and there's no cross slope because the older ones were diagonal and they had a cross slope. So you were struggling with a non-compliant plus a cross slope. So these are much more straightforward. But you can see the new cores going in. One thing I'd like to mention that is actually fairly important, and it's on the rear. It's on the bottom level. It's something that Gabe had mentioned. He mentioned the rear walkway that we're putting in. We're putting that walkway in to provide added egress from the building. Right now, if you come out of that building, you come out of the stair 2, second stair, you're confronted with the ledge and ground. So there's really no path to exit to the public way. So I met with Michael Clancy. We talked about it. I showed him what I was proposing. Basically what's going to happen is the egress paths from both stairs are going to wind themselves around and come out to a public way. So we're not willy-nilly trying to impact the site. It's actually something that is required, in my opinion. So that's the, you can see the lower level. Most of the elements pretty much remain the same, except for that bridge. That bridge is being changed, and it's being changed positively. This, just to give you a sense of what, and this is sort of a flip thing. This was a test fit I did for one large tenant, but it's colored, and you kind of get the sense of what the space might look like. It has workstations in it. This is the entrance level, obviously, and then that is the lower level. You were asking about the lower level, whether it's occupied, and it's partially occupied. There are 2 excavated areas on the sides, and you can see the stair towers dumping out to the rear of the building. And then that is the upper level. Again, you can see the core. This is a previous iteration of the core because the core has been developed more further in the new plans, but that gives you a general sense of what we're proposing. And as I mentioned, we are also doing, this actually happened to be the photometric analysis that we did for all the lighting, but we also are doing a new roof. We're putting fairly large RTUs on the roof, and this is the working drawing elevation, if you will, of the building. So you can see all the new glazing elements. The side elevation, we're replacing, it's all going to be new, but it's going to be EFIS and exterior finish system and glazing. One side is fully masonry, and then you can see along the rear we've made all the stair improvements. And everything will comply with the access board. So we needed relief just on that front entrance.
Thank you.
Any questions?
I just want to pause before we ask for questions. We will get to that. But I just want to talk about the fact that we unfortunately have a hard stop at 7:45. So I guess what I want to do is just try to get to the nitty-gritty quickly. I'm going to ask Mary, actually, if you would sort of frame for us where that leaves us in terms of, for example, the changes that they made, to what extent did they satisfy your comments? Can you confirm that the changes satisfy fire's concerns? And sort of give us the summary from your perspective, please.
Certainly, I'm happy to do that. The applicant has responded to all of the questions. Fire department is satisfied with the crushed granite. That's an acceptable surface. From my perspective, the applicant provided supplemental landscaping where it made sense without taking out ledge or landscaping to put some in. So it seemed like a very thoughtful response. From staff's perspective, all the technical comments have been addressed, and it's for the board to go through the site plan review criteria. There's 4 waivers being requested, and then your A3.
Okay, can you list the waivers that are being requested?
Yes, I'd be happy to.
Thank you.
There's a waiver to allow 78 spaces where 154 are required. There is a waiver request to not require curb stops. Some of this overhangs landscaped areas.
Yep.
There's a waiver to allow less than 24 feet of driveway width in parking lots with 90-degree parking. And there's a waiver to allow greater than 4% maximum parking lot grade and to allow the existing sheet flow drainage to remain. And I have those listed on this handout, which I'll pass down for you. And I will just note that this is a re-tenanting of a site, so to the extent that made sense, some of the existing infrastructure remains in place, and I had requested the applicant upgrade as practicable. And that's what you heard him explain for the drainage, for example.
Okay, thank you. With that, I will ask my board members if they have comments and questions.
I had a couple of questions. Relative to the parking and the circulation roadway system.
Yep.
I noticed that there are quite a few very narrow areas at curves. And I'm just wondering, on a 90-degree single-loaded parking, what's the clear aisle width required?
It's, regardless of whether it's on one side or two, the current regulations are 24
So
feet.
24 feet. So if you have basically an 18 or a 19-foot car long is trying to turn 90 degrees up towards the front of the building and it's 18.6, I guess I have some questions. I don't know how feasible or practical that is. I'm just also, given that this is a fairly level or open site, I'm curious as to why the roadway widths can't meet the minimum and why the main aisle can't meet the minimum requirement.
So, a couple things, I guess, to tackle that first. When you come through here, it's, the driveways and even the parking lots are really fit in between the ledge. So everything you see here in the middle here, this is essentially a large ledge outcropping. And the same along here. On this edge, we're up against the 25-foot no disturb wetland buffer, and we're within the inner 100-foot riparian zone. And there's a steep slope coming off this way. So we really didn't see, without, if we head down that road, it's kind of a domino effect. We increase the impervious area, and then we're triggering a whole nother level of stormwater improvements that would require further ledge removal, that would require further tree removal, and then you head down that path of really being infeasible for the project. So to tackle the parking lot areas themselves, one of the things I focused on when I did the striping plan, Gary, was to actually focus on providing dimensionally compliant parking spaces. It's one of those things, it's the balancing act. If I shortened those a little bit, which is really, I think, how the site interacted to get a wider drive aisle, we're giving up, a little bit of the striped space to add to the dimension of the parking. That tied into the request for the curb stop waiver, because the way vehicles interact with the parking lot today, they actually have a good amount of overhang through that parking lot that they can utilize today, and we didn't want to put a hard curb or try and introduce a hard curb in those areas that then may limit the extent that they use that, because I think all of that, it's kind of natural when they pull up that they have even more overhang than you'd have with a curb stop. So it was those aspects interacting together, along with the fact that, we know that it's been an office building in use for 40 years. So there's been a track record of it.
So I guess the question I have is, you're putting in hard curbs, but you're not putting in curb stops, so you allow the 2-foot overhang over the hard curb.
We're not proposing
You're not
curbing.
putting any curbs,
Correct.
any
Yep.
perimeter curbs.
Except replacing the existing curb that's along this edge that captures the drainage.
So is there any risk for flow that's going to not be contained within the parking area? In other words, are all the grades such that flow is within the paved area? I mean, if you don't have curbs, you can't really direct the flow.
Right. So it essentially drains down, and then it utilizes the curb that's along here and the curb that's along this edge. So all of this comes down this way. This area, from about here down, actually drains down and off this side. We did propose a stormwater recharge interceptor trench along that edge to capture it, but everything is captured internal to the site, and the bulk majority of it is all delivered to this one low spot.
So, okay, why can't the aisle and the 18.6 aisle at the handicap spaces, and I'm assuming those are visitor parking spaces because they're close to the building and so people would not be as familiar, why can't that aisle be the 24 feet or whatever the minimum is? In other words, I see the rest of the circulation is, from what I read in your notes, is one-way circulation everywhere.
Yep,
Except for the dead-end area of the parking on the northwest side,
yep.
and that's, but you got the 25 feet, so I'm not concerned there. And then everything turns around here into the one-way, which seems to be doable. If it's only one-way, if it were two-way, I don't think it could be doable. But why can't the parking spaces in front of the building be either 45 degrees, which would allow a narrower aisle, or, because it looks like the island is splayed, so you could do a 45 rather than a 90. and then you could get a wide enough aisle. It seems to me the cars are going to back out of those spaces, and they're going to have to back and forth 2 or 3 times to turn. A 19-foot-long car or an 18-foot-long car isn't going to be able to turn.
Well-
An 18-foot-6 wide aisle.
Yeah, you know, as it developed, I hadn't considered angled parking there, and we'd really focused on the approach that it was. One of the things we did do, Gary, was actually put a curb here and put the pedestrians up on the sidewalk on the other side, with the goal that we really don't want them walking down the main drive aisle there. We wanted to give them a respite where it doesn't exist elsewhere.
The current condition is there's no sidewalk there?
There's a bituminous concrete one that's in really poor shape.
Okay.
Is the current condition 90-degree parking at those handicap spaces, or is it angled?
It's 90 today.
And we actually showed that 90-degree parking to the access point.
Yes.
The accessible path from that parking was a direct 90-degree across the walkway. There's a splayed sidewalk, you go up and over to the
So I guess the other related question I have is you're looking for a waiver to do about half of the parking spaces that are required. Is the occupancy of the building going to be less than it is now, or before you made these changes?
So there's essentially no change in use, no change in occupancy. The square footage of the building isn't changing, so there's no change in intensity over the current use.
Was the original parking quantity as of right when the building was originally permitted? Or was there a waiver granted then?
When going back, we couldn't find anything that went back that far to show it. The last thing I could find that was approved by this board was in early 2000, and it was for a project here that didn't occur. But it set the existing condition at 72 spaces. And so I could probably have laid something out at 72, but we're going from 72 up to 78 plus so we tried to eke out as many as we could with what we had to work
I
with.
share Gary's concern on this. I suspect many of us do, because this is a very large waiver. And I know in your submittals, you talked about a couple of things, that, your business model doesn't work if there's not enough parking for your tenants. So that would prevent you from,
Yep.
having more tenants than can possibly park there. And furthermore, you own other properties and could consider a shared parking arrangement. However, this is still a very big waiver to grant. So I'm interested in thinking about a look-back period where if we were to consider granting this waiver, we agree that we're going to look back at it at some period of time to check in on how it's going, whether it's once you're half tenanted or fully tenanted or just a period of time, I'm not sure. But because it is such a large waiver, Gary, I agree that
Yeah,
I feel
yeah.
like we need to,
I would agree, too. Yeah.
Okay.
Also, the other concern, too, is, are the grades steeper on this parking lot where the widths and the clearances are small?
No,
looking for a
the
4%?
majority of the slope is actually in the segments of drive aisle that don't have, there's a little bit here and here, and then this is the steepest component here. So it was areas that they didn't have parking on them currently.
So you're looking for a waiver to increase the gradient of the slope from 3%? What is it,
So
3%?
we're not proposing to change it. We were just acknowledging that we weren't sure we needed the waiver because there isn't parking associated with those areas, but we were acknowledging that the driveway slopes in those two locations exceeded the 4% currently.
Gary, given the time constraints,
Yeah,
I'd just
okay.
like to move on to another board member. We can certainly come
that's
back.
I think, could we tackle the look back?
Yeah?
We're more than happy to
Okay.
deal with the look back.
Okay.
We're in a good position where they're going to be actively marketing to tenants. If we think if a tenant comes to them and doesn't think it's enough parking for them, we have to work
Right.
something out.
Right. Understood.
And the look back would be a good way to handle that.
Yeah. Okay. Do you have questions, Bill?
No, my only questions that Gary asked were about the 76 spaces that you were missing and the driveway width, just general comment. This is a good area for something like this, no residential butters, so we talk about lighting and traffic, it's not going to be a problem. So I think this is a good project, I'm going to make it work.
Yeah. Gordon, Ted?
No, those are my questions, I think, as well. I mean, I'm assuming that if the look back suggests that you need more parking, that you can find it somewhere without...
Yeah, and the good news is A.W. Perry owns a lot of property immediately around it. I mean, even as close as Two Pond Park right next door. So they've got options for parking, for shared arrangements if one becomes needed.
Ted?
Yeah, that was my question as
Okay.
well, and I was in there today actually taking a look at it, and the back of that parking lot seemed to be fairly open during the day, so,
At 2 Pond Park.
yeah. Yeah, right next door.
Okay, Gary, then back to you. Do you have anything else?
I guess the other questions I have, I'm still have a concern about the no curbs, given the gradient of the roadways, and everything I understand drains towards the north, but it converges as you go towards the north, and the only curb you have is the one in front of the building. Wouldn't there be curbs? I guess I'm not totally reconciled with not having curbs, given the grades and given the, kind of the topography here. The other question is, what about cross slopes and walking in the parking lot and winter conditions and ice and things like that? I see the 2 catch basins here, but everything looks like it sheet flows to one area.
That's right. So to tackle the curbing side of it, this parking lot in its current grading does not rely on curbing to convey the water. It's actually the edges of pavement, and most of the conditions are actually the high part of it, and it swales down and then heads down through the middle of it. So from that aspect of it, we're not relying on the edge treatment to be the primary conveyance of the stormwater. Our goal, there is some cracking in the parking lot. We are proposing to repave it. We've also proposed, which I submitted to the record, a formal written stormwater O&M to address all the requirements of street sweeping, heating, and the monitoring, inspections, maintenance, all of that stuff, which obviously isn't part of the record today. So that was something that I formally created and
Is it a
submitted as well.
vortex type of a catch basin system?
So we've got, there's two low spots. They're in fairly close proximity, so we put deep sump hoods in both
Okay.
locations, but then we tied them together to a jellyfish, and then a pipe outlet at the bottom of the slope with some stone to eliminate the waterfall effect that's going down the edge treatment today.
The only other questions I have are architectural in terms of the building. In terms of sustainability, how are we dealing with heat island, and are you going to do a light-colored roof, or what other kinds of sustainable design elements would you put in the renovated portion of the building?
Well, the glazing system will be highly efficient. We're going with a fairly high-end curtain wall from Conair, which it'll have all the bells and whistles on the glazing itself. The roof, we have not yet determined whether we're going to go with a light-colored roof. Presently, actually, the roof that we presently have is actually in fairly good condition, but because of the extent to which we're going to be invasive up there, particularly with the roof edge on the front facade, because when we play around with the coping, we haven't yet decided what the direction is for that roof from a sustainability perspective. The one interesting note, just real quickly, this building, next time you're out there, take a look at it, because every one of those razor edges on the scissor, the roof actually steps down. It's fairly complicated. It all sheet flows from front to back, and each of those little pockets sort of also shape. It's a very interesting roof, so we'll have fun. We'll have fun with the redesign, but it'll work well.
Great.
Okay. Oh, yeah, Ted.
I saw some mention of snow removal. What do you do with the snow currently on that site, and what would be the plan in the future?
So we actually, as part of we showed a couple of things. One, to us, it made sense to not allow any snow removal to be pushed to the side with the resource areas. So we've actually, on our plans, included signage all along here about no snow dumping along that entire edge. And then we've designated areas internal to the parking lots, off the backs, and away from the overhang where it could be pushed if need be, given the limited widths that exist on the driveways. If it got so bad that that wasn't enough, then I think we'd be looking at physical removal from the site and trucking. I think one of the keys that we looked at was, you don't want to take away from the widths that are already there and the parking space count, so we made sure to show areas outside of that on the plan.
So in terms of process from here, I mean, we're bumping up against our deadline, but just in general, how are we feeling about moving forward through site plan review? Is it something that we think we should try to tackle now, or do we need to continue?
You have the same panel tomorrow night, so if you can't, you could do it tomorrow night, but it's up to the board.
Do we have a hard stop at
pretty hard
7:45?
stop,
Okay.
yeah.
I mean, I'm comfortable doing it tonight, but it's 7:45 now, so.
Yeah, we don't want to give it short. It'll
Yeah.
probably take a good 15 minutes at least, right? So unfortunately, we will need to continue. But you're right, tomorrow night would be a good option. I'm not sure if that works for the applicant.
Can we get to it tomorrow night, though? We had a lot on the agenda.
Ted's sitting on Station Street, so if you did it right after Station Street,
Then we got...
then Ted would be here, so you'd have the same
The
panel.
marina tomorrow night, too, right?
Yeah, but you would slip this in right after
I think
Station
this would
Street.
be relatively quick,
Okay.
don't you?
Yes.
Do you think
That's fine with me.
you could get through it quickly tomorrow night, Gary? Presumably?
Well, presumably, but it always takes longer than we think. but,
Well, right,
You know,
right.
Always does.
I don't think it's an hour.
Always
Just
does.
being realistic.
It always does. All right, tomorrow night it is.
I think we should try for tomorrow night, if that works for you.
See you tomorrow night?
All right, Rich.
Okay.
All right, so we need you to sign, and then I'll continue.
Yeah, and you guys need to vote to continue. the site
I
plan.
make a motion that we continue the application for South Shore Industrial Park Trust 4 Pond Park to January 30th, 2018.
Any further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
So, Commissioner Name's signature.
Thanks, Ted. Thanks for your time. Yeah, thanks. Good night, thank you.
Thank you, Gil.
Night, thank you.
And
Already. Oh, yeah, she's terrific, isn't she?
She a lawyer?
Yeah,
She an attorney? She practicing?
very good, yeah.
She practicing?
I think she's retired, I think. I think she consults, I don't know, I mean, she's absolutely,
Husband's a good guy.
yeah.
He's a real good guy, really nice guy.
Next to the movie star.
Lucky.
I told everyone else.
No, you can do it.
Gary, I know you don't need an introduction, but I'm gonna turn around your pale thing for you. Everybody knows Gary.
I didn't even realize it was back.
In case someone doesn't show up, I think.
You're joining us?
You can go over there if you want.
Sit down. Absolutely.
Yeah, be fine.
Okay. I'll go grab that stuff over there for you, 'cause that's what's for you. Yep. If this is gonna drive you nuts rolling, I can go over there.
Yes.
Good here.
So,
About that, that's what I'm
Okay.
gonna be okay.
The next item on our agenda this evening is a public hearing for the proposed amendments to the Hingham zoning bylaw accessory dwelling units And before we go any further, I just want to explain the change in lighting is because one of our board members, and the sunglasses and the hat you can't get to, she's suffering the ill effects of a concussion, so we're trying to accommodate the light sensitivity by bringing the lights down a bit. Okay, so before we get started with the details of the proposed accessory dwelling unit zoning bylaw amendment, I just want to take a minute to back up and set the stage for our discussion tonight. Starting with, first of all, what is an accessory dwelling unit? An accessory dwelling unit, or an ADU as we call them, is an independent apartment unit in an owner-occupied, single-family home that can be either attached to or detached from the primary dwelling unit. So then the next question is, what is the background on this topic in Hingham, here in Hingham? And this is a topic that's familiar to all of us, and it has been visited and revisited at some level over the years. In fact, even the 2002 master plan recommended a goal of allowing accessory apartments in larger homes. And more recently, in the fall of 2014, winter of 2015, there was an accessory dwelling unit study group chaired by Gary Tundorf-Dick that studied the issue very closely over the course of 15 meetings, and they wrote a draft zoning bylaw, which for several reasons they didn't end up recommending that go forward to town meeting that year. So where are we now? In the summer of 2017, the Board of Selectmen identified having accessory dwelling unit zoning bylaw as a priority for the town. The Board of Selectmen are interested in helping residents by providing an affordable alternative to stay in their home through multi-generational living. They're concerned about the safety of ADUs that could be constructed without any regulation, and they believe that there's a demand for this type of housing option in town. Our role as the planning board, when informed of this priority, is to react to this and to have this conversation about what would be best for the town and craft a zoning bylaw amendment to put forth at town meeting to let the townspeople vote on. So as further background, it's worth remembering that, as I already said, ADUs was part of the master plan housing recommendations 16 years ago in 2002, and remained part of the 2017 master plan goals revisions that we worked on last year. Additionally, as many of you already know, there is proposed state legislation that, if it were to pass, would allow ADUs by right, which means with no special permit process at all, in all cities and towns. Those cities and towns can put in reasonable regulations, but the state is proposing legislation that would take some of that away from us in terms of deciding the process for us. So all of these reasons point to why we're considering an ADU zoning bylaw at this time. So the first thing we did, this board did, was last fall, we decided to take a look at the work product from Gary's ADU study group. And this group had socialized the issue for many months, and they came up with a proposed amendment. So we looked at it, and we decided that we wanted to take their hard work as a starting point. But what we also decided was that we wanted to narrow the scope. We wanted to only include ADUs within the primary dwelling unit. So this is important and bears repeating that the proposed zoning bylaw amendment that's before us tonight does not contemplate allowing ADUs in accessory structures such as garages, carriage houses, or barns. It only contemplates allowing them within the primary dwelling. Much of the opposition to ADUs in Hingham relates to people worried about having people live in these accessory structures. So we decided to eliminate that type at this time. It's possible that if in the future the town wanted to expand the definition and address the accessory structures, they certainly could, but that's not what we're doing at this time. So we took that work product from the study group, and we removed all references to accessory structures, and we reformatted it a little bit and reorganized it to make it consistent with our zoning bylaw. We've received some public comment to date, including a letter dated January 24th, 2018 from Catherine Salisbury, and we're looking forward to receiving more public input tonight. And then as a board, the next step will be that we need to go through the proposed zoning bylaw amendment line by line and have the conversations that we need to have and make any changes that are necessary. So what we should try to accomplish, what I would like to accomplish tonight, is that we first and foremost want to hear from the public that is here to comment on this matter. we're not going to have a back and forth conversation with the public tonight. We're going to have a listening session where we will, as a board, listen to what those of you that have come to speak have to say. And then we will move into, as I said before, looking at the proposal and start to march through it, starting with the purpose. I think that will be the obvious place to start. So we'll take public comment for a while, then we'll close the public comment period so that we can start to talk about it in great detail tonight. And if you're not here tonight, if you're watching on TV, you're welcome to submit public comment at any time by looking on the Planning Board's webpage and clicking on the Contact Us button. So with that being said,
If I could, Jennifer, I just wanted to just make a couple of comments. The Planning Board Study Committee on the accessory dwelling units in our deliberations felt a number of things. One of the reasons that we tabled this unanimously in 2015 is because even though we had done an exhaustive amount of research and we had looked at 15 peer towns, some towns had model bylaws, had addressed a lot of the issues. Some towns regretted passing a very loosely defined warrant article and now are living to try to recoup some of the problems. We felt that as thorough as our research was, it wasn't complete, and it didn't address all of the unanticipated consequences. And I think that in looking at some of the model bylaws that we looked at when we were researching our draft, there are a number of changes that I'd like to incorporate into this one as we go through the discussions. The other thing that I also wanted to point out is that the Accessory Dwelling Unit Study Committee only recommended initially and in the final draft that the accessory unit be considered in the primary dwelling. The committee never recommended, or even though they studied it, they never recommended putting an accessory dwelling unit in an accessory structure like a barn or a garage. So I just wanted to clarify that. And then the other thing that the committee felt towards the end of the discussions, which was finalizing criteria from the duration of the discussions, is that we really needed to very clearly define what a single-family residence is and the concept of one dwelling on one lot, and how an accessory dwelling unit, even if it's subordinate to the primary residence, does allow two dwellings on one lot. But what we felt is we didn't have enough definition and criteria to distinguish an accessory dwelling unit from a two-family residence. Because right now, Hingham's zoning bylaw is based on one house on one lot, one dwelling unit on one lot. It's single-family zoning. And that's a key point in all of this, because I think in the unanticipated consequences, unintended consequences, I should say, we don't want this thing to, I don't think the town really wants this thing to grow into a two-family zoning premise for all the residential districts in the town. So I think it's something to really focus on further as part of the discussions. The other thing I'd also like to say is that we looked at a number of the smart growth model bylaws that have been published since, and these are published by either MAPC, the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, or other planning organizations in the country. And there are a number of enforcement criteria points and definition points in the model bylaw which are not in this proposed zoning article, which should be added to tighten it up. And I think they did a lot of really good thinking and research. So we should look at those provisions too in our discussions.
great, thank you, Gary. So then let us move to public comment. If you wish to comment, please step forward to the microphone, because this meeting is obviously being videotaped, and that way everyone can hear you, and state your name and address for the record, and direct your comments to me. And as I said before, we're not going to have a back and forth, so if you ask questions, that's great, and we'll consider your questions, but we're not going to be responding to your questions at this point in time tonight. Who would like to start? Peter, thanks.
Peter Vickers, 65 Lozelle Street, and first I'll speak for the Board of Health. And we've corresponded with you by means of letter that Susan Sarney wrote on behalf of the board. And the board hasn't looked at this really and discussed it favorably or unfavorably. We just have pointed out some of the issues that are important to us. And they're before you, but for the rest of the audience listening, our concern is Title V and Hingham supplementary rules and regulations for septic systems, because it's obviously based on bedrooms, and the bedrooms are based on water flow. So we want to make sure, first of all, that the size of the septic system is adequate to supplement any additional people living in the house. And there are a couple of ways we do bedroom counts, and that would certainly enter into the discussion and the permitting for this process. Personally, I think it's a good idea to get this out. There are a number of two-family houses in town. There are a number, I know, of dwelling units that are illegal and being illegally used. And maybe this process will set up a legal way to monitor and guide this use. So anyway, in short, the Board of Health will stay involved in this. We'll stay involved with the planning board, the building department, and follow this, and probably have a recommendation for you before you make your decision.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Peter.
Peter, question. The Board of Health wrote a memo, at least we saw it in an email a little bit earlier. Do we have that, a copy of that, hard copy?
It's on
Mary?
our website, and I know that Mary gave it to us. Thank you.
Yeah, and it's available at the Board of Health office if anyone needs it. Thanks.
It's on our website.
Okay.
Who else? Judy.
Hi.
Welcome.
Hey, welcome back.
Hi, it's good to be here. Judy Sneath, 89 North Street. So I'll just tell you what, I read this, I think it's fantastic. It is definitely meeting a market need and a need for a lot of residents in this town to stay in their homes after their children are gone, and to stay in Hingham. So the one, just starting from the top, the one purpose that I don't see articulated here is smart growth or sustainable communities, and I just wonder about, actually stating that, and maybe if there were a difference in lot size, thinking about lots that are in proximity to train, bus, and boat, rather than off in the wilderness where you need more cars. Which leads me to my first of just 3 points. Why a restriction on lot size? I don't understand how that fits into the purpose of the bylaw. Why a restriction on the number of bathrooms? As Mr. Bickford said, you would hope that this would comply with the Title V standards, and that it would require Board of Health approval if it weren't on sewer, so I don't see the reason to limit the number of bathrooms. It could be that it just makes sense for a certain part of the house to be partitioned off, and there are 2 bathrooms or a bath and a half, and it just doesn't seem to add to the interpretation of this bylaw. And then the third is, I wonder why the permit would expire in 3 years. What is the point in my investing in my home to do this and then having the permit expire? I don't think other permits expire in that way. It adds a bureaucratic layer to the process and doesn't seem at all friendly to people who want to do this. So thank you, and I look forward to hearing your discussion.
Thank you.
Jennifer, I might share one observation on Judy's comments.
Gary, we're not going to have a back and forth right now, but when we get to
Okay.
it in the
All right,
bylaw,
just
you
make
can
a note of
absolutely
it.
make sure you bring it up, please.
Okay.
Deirdre.
Jen, we do have handouts up here, too, if people need copies.
Oh, what do we have? Hold on, Deirdre, I'm sorry. Mary's reminding me that we have handouts up here. We have the,
So I have copies of the model regulation and copies of the draft regulation that we'll be discussing tonight, and then kind of a marked-up copy of an earlier version. None of it's new, but by all means.
thank you.
Hi, Deirdre Anderson, 31 Old Colony Road, and first I wanted to thank all of you for all the hard work you've been doing on many important topics this season. It's really appreciated, and all the back work on this. I have not had a chance to read all the draft language, but I do just want to say for the record, my family is a case study of how an accessory dwelling unit could help seniors age in place, which I think is a really important concept given the demographic trends in our community, in all communities. You know, my parents raised our family in our historic home, and then when my mom was a widow, it just made sense for our family to move into the home and have her stay with us. We didn't think about an accessory dwelling unit, not only because it isn't allowed, but just personally, and I think people should think about this, I wouldn't want that look in our house. So I think, you know, if we went to sell the house later down the road, you know, I wouldn't have wanted a separate apartment unit. I think it would have taken away from the character of our house, having seen that with other family members' homes. But that being said, for people who are concerned that this would, you know, hurt some of our larger historic homes in town, I think I'm curious if towns that have permitted this, like Newton, you know, what the rush to permits have been, because this process, it would be expensive and time-consuming. So I do think that that's something, and as we head towards town meeting, that's important to remember, that I don't think we would see you know, I think I read an article where it said when the city of Portland did this, and that's the city of Portland, Oregon, it was like 96 permits in the first year. 10 years later, they're in the hundreds, but I think that's something to keep in mind. The other question, and I'll read the language, but is how specific we can be on the architectural similarity of any addition. Do we want to think about, it echoes what Judy said, you know, do we define walkable, bikeable areas, that these accessory dwelling units are permitted in primary units that are within walking distance to public transportation, or that are within walking distance to a commercial, you know, somewhere to get groceries. I think that makes for a healthier town. And then other aspects like where the new door is, or the fire escape facing the back, to preserve the integrity of the street facing. So those are just some thoughts. I think it would be a wonderful way to help our seniors age in place, and in the homes that they have been in, if we're talking about an owner-occupied primary dwelling, or in the owner being in the accessory dwelling. And I think it would give families a lot of housing options that I would be supportive of. So those are just my comments.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Mr. Patch.
Hi, Tom Patch. I just, you know, I haven't really made up my mind about this issue, but I think, you know, one of the things is we need to remember before we start making this drastic change on our zoning, because that's what this is. I mean, in reality, we're going from a zoning decision that was made basically in the 40s and 50s of primarily a single-family residential zoning concept to allowing multifamily, and that's what it is. Whether you want to call it an accessory dwelling, an in-law apartment, whatever, you're having more than one family, even if it's extended family. So it's important that we try to understand why the town made that decision in the 40s and the 50s. And I don't think we can really go forward in a meaningful way until we understand that. And one of the problems with that is that there's been a lot of growth in this town under that zoning scheme of single family. And there are particularized things why people would want to have single family. Back in the 20s, when a lot of zoning was being challenged through the courts, and a lot of municipalities were implementing single-family residential districts, there was a lot of challenges to that, and the courts recognized the values of single-family residential districts, like space, issues of traffic, issues of fire, and so forth. So now what we've basically done is we've created this housing scheme based on this single-family norm, and we're intensifying the density. And we need to look at those issues. We need to look at the traffic issues. We need to look at the fire issues. These types of things need to be addressed. And in our town, because of the Title V issues that Mr. Bickford's brought up, the septic issues, I think the reality of this is the impact of this is going to be felt disproportionately on the most densely house part of the town, which is the part of the town that's on sewer. So it's, this is a big problem. We already have, these, and you got to remember, I think, I wasn't around then. I don't think any of us were around then. Gary maybe, I don't know. But back in the 40s and 50s, I think there was a reaction to this real dense development of these very small lots to expand, the area, the dimensional requirements for residential housing, to try to address that, to try to address the density. And South Hingham being essentially the last area of the town really to be developed. It was back in the 50s, Justice Whittemore, who lived up off of Gardner Street, used to call it upcountry, and because that was the last area that was being developed. There were a lot of farms and so forth up in that area. So that area, you really see, in particular, the implementation of, this zoning scheme, this broadened dimensional requirements. So that's the first concern that I have. The second concern I have, which is sort of the bugaboo in all this, is the 40B housing count issue. Because what you're doing, if my understanding is correct, is even by special permit, if you're authorizing these units will count as market rate housing. And therefore, all the hard work that we've done and all the sacrifice that we've done with Avalon and Broadstone Alliance to get to that safe harbor, to get to that magic 10% number, is going to be unwound. And, one of the issues here, I look at one of the reasons for this, is to bring into compliance the illegal apartments in the town. And I've been told anecdotally that there's a belief that there are somewhere around 300 to 400 illegal apartments in town. That's quite a number to bring in at once, okay? With all due respect, I think we need to do a better job enforcing rather than essentially creating this amnesty and the impact of this. I think that's one of the issues that hasn't been addressed. If you look at the DHCD's regulations, they do have provisions for accessory apartments being, and I think Susan can speak to this as well. Correct me if I'm wrong, please, Susan. They do have regulations that address that, how you can have an accessory unit considered subsidized. It's an extremely onerous process. I just can't believe that your typical single-family home resident is going to do that and subject themselves to a regulatory agreement and all of that. Okay, I just don't see that happening in reality. So I think the reality of this is that these units brought in are all going to be market rate units. With respect to taking a very cautious approach on this, I think it's appropriate because once we open this door, we're not going to unscrew this. Okay, it's going to be very hard to roll it back. And in terms of time frames, okay, in my experience dealing with housing, proponents like to come in and plead their particular circumstances as a reason why they should get relief. And typically the relief is in perpetuity. There's no time limit on it. But their circumstances are actually relatable in terms of a time issue. Like if they have a parent who has to come and live with them, there's only a certain expectation for that. So if someone's going to have an in-law apartment, because of their unique circumstances with their parent, I don't think it's unreasonable to put a time frame on this so that you can revisit this, so you don't have situations where it starts out as an in-law and for someone's particular mother, father, or whatever it is, and then it morphs into something else, because that's the reality of it. And I think, I don't purport to speak for our building department and our zoning department, but I think there's a lot of stuff going on in town. And what you're doing is you're creating an oversight issue for them. I understand there's an oversight issue, putting a time frame on it, but you're creating a even higher burden if you're doing it in perpetuity. At least if you put some obligation in there, you put it on record. Potentially the next person who buys this just doesn't say, oh, well, there's a variance there or a special permit, whatever it is, the relief that says you can have an in-law apartment, I'm good, okay? By having a time frame on it, having it in the permit, having it recorded, it puts the purchaser on notice that there are limitations to this, and they're going to have to come back in and make their case again. So I don't think it's really inappropriate. I think it's a smart thing for the board to do, because I think they're anticipating that there's going to be some level of an oversight issue. So those are some of the basic thoughts that I have about this issue. Like I said, I haven't made up my mind either way, because I realize that we do have in our zoning bylaw the right for properties that were in existence with at least 6 rooms prior to the creation of our zoning bylaw to do this by special permit. I just think that the issues and the merits of why that was created dealt with a set of circumstances 70 years ago. And we're dealing with a totally different set of circumstances today and the impacts if we want to expand on that. So that's just something I think the board should think about. Thank you.
Thanks. Who else would like to speak? Ted, thanks.
Ted Matthews, 102 Hersey Street, and I won't speak for very long, but accessory dwelling units are something that I think the town of Hingham should consider at this point. You guys have put in a lot of work related to this. Obviously, there are some things we need to think about still, but putting them in areas where the sewer is probably a good first step. As some of the, I don't know as far as I'm on a sewer, I don't know if all of the sewers for the larger homes in town are up to date and that sort of thing, so they would have to deal with that as well. I understand there are permitting and enforcement issues. This program would grow to capture that, I would assume, through permit fees and et cetera. but I think, other places in the country have dealt with this quite effectively, and it's time to move forward. And baby steps, but time to move forward. Thank you.
You plan to speak, Chief?
Yeah. Good evening. Glenn Olson from the Police Department. I was sort of responding to and had reviewed some of the things, and the planning coordinator put out some questions to the department heads, and I sort of responded to them. There was a section in there, I think when I looked at this, I looked at it as a police officer and what's going to happen when I go to one of these calls, and what are the problems that we're going to see as in relation. So I was just, with that in mind, it's just a fine-tuning, because I do believe these are a necessary thing coming forward for the future of the town. And I think as long as we regulate them properly, it would be a positive thing. I just think that there was a mention in there about if in the absence of an owner, they're allowed to be away for a year. I just think there should be something in there that fine-tunes that a little bit and says they can't sublease it out in the meantime. A little bit of concern about the police response or fire response when they're talking about entrances in the rear or the side of a building. I think it's important that when we respond to the fire response, we can easily identify these units as, a separate unit. So that sort of ties into the same idea of how we mark them. And then I was thinking about where do you put mailboxes? Because that's going to be a requirement. I think that the post office might, I'm sure they require dual mailboxes, not one mailbox. So where would you put those? Was just a comment. My really own main concern about this is the fact that I was sort of reading this, and I never really saw a lot of people refer these to as in-law apartments, and I don't see any restriction to a family member. So technically, these could be units that people could put on their house and then lease out sort of as apartments. So there is no actual tie, and that would be the only problem that I would see, that eventually could it become a burden on a neighborhood if that happens. Or if you're renting someone to two people, are there going to be two cars? So I'm in the favor of having two parking spaces as opposed to one. But I think it's something that's a great start, and I think we're really going to need these as time goes on. So I am in favor of it. All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Does anyone else wish to speak? Okay. You'll have another opportunity, if not tonight. This is not the last time we'll be discussing this. So thank you for all that public comment, and presumably we'll get even more written comment. This is a big topic. I think that, as I suggested before, I think that the next good step would be to start looking at the proposed bylaw as a group, which we haven't done in detail yet, and to start to go through it, starting with the purpose. A lot of the comments we've heard tonight even, talk about limiting it and talk about the character of our town, which is things that we on this board talk about a lot. And so a couple of things we'll want to think about as we go through it is what is the purpose, and then making sure we tie all of the provisions within the bylaw to the purpose. And limiting it in a way that we think is appropriate for the town, but not over-limiting it so that no one can actually use it, and that the existing apartments that may or may not be out there that are legal, they won't come forward, because we've limited it so much that no one can even try to make their existing one legal. So with that being said, assuming we agree that the next step would be to start marching through, that's what I would like to do.
I have one question before we start, though.
Absolutely.
It was brought up in one of the comments, but do we know why the 1941 town meeting voted to restrict? Was it growth? I've always kind of wondered why. But maybe it's a good question for the Hingham Then and Now Facebook page.
That's right.
I've always kind of wondered, was it growth? I mean, no one, and we did this a couple of years ago, we talked about it too, and I was kind of just curious, and I love the history of the town, and I love all of the ins and outs of what happened over time, but I was kind of
I
wondering.
thought, Bill, that
Yeah.
some of the things that I've heard on that have been that it was the way that they obtained the support for the passage of the bylaw change in 1941 was to grandfather all of the buildings that were not in compliance with the bylaw. Because if you had a series of, 7 or 8 room, they had very specific criteria, 7-room or 8-room house had to have a certain lot size that fit a certain description of house that might have been used in more of a nuclear family context where you had multiple generations in the house, or you had an income apartment in the house. Especially, World War I, World War II, there were a lot of people who rented out small spaces in their houses. So I think it was a reaction to having people support a newer bylaw, which was basically single-family zoning.
Makes sense.
Do you wish to reply, Susan?
Yeah. Bill, a couple of years ago, when the board was looking at the two-family provision in Section 3A, we went back. I don't have it for tonight because we weren't focused on that. But we went back and we looked at the history of that provision, and it didn't start out that way in 1941. It changed over time, and when the two-family went in, it inserted kind of retroactively. It didn't, in 1941, that only houses in existence in 1941 was not in the bylaw. So there was kind of changes over time. I think the bylaw evolves based on, what's happening in the town at a given period in time. So I think we could go back, because we still have that from a couple of years ago in our files, kind of the history of that two-family provision. As we're talking history, when I got elected to the planning board in 2000, the planning board was talking about looking at accessory dwelling units. So it's something, and I don't believe that's the first time it was ever discussed. So I think it's just been one of those, historically, a topic that's kind of come and faded and come back up for many years.
Thanks. Okay.
Can I pass a few things out? Or will
I would love that,
disrupt
thank you.
So, Madam Chair, I have for the board just a couple of handouts. I have a copy of the zoning regulations from Concord. I have copies of the letter from the Board of Health as requested. And I have a memo from Mike Clancy, the building commissioner, with some comments for you. And I also, I don't know if we'll need it tonight or not, but I did do a quick map, and I only have a few copies, so maybe we could share for now. I did a quick map showing all of the lots, 10,000 square feet or smaller, sewer districts, and all of the pre-1940 parcels. And so it may be premature for your discussion of purpose, but it may be a good aid as we talk about how much we're really limiting. And I do have a couple extra copies if anybody would like to see one.
Less than 10,000?
Yep.
That's a lot. That's all of them, Mary?
I did it from the assessor's data. Want to take one? You can share it with someone, yeah.
These are lots, these are year built, the red is 19.
And so it was interesting, does somebody else want one?
Because look, these lots over here look like they're the exact same size.
I did it from the assessor's data.
Go ahead.
That's my caveat.
That's what, no, what else could you use, right?
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, they could be 10,001.
So this reminds me that, that in addition to this letter that we have from Mike Clancy and the letter that Peter Bickford referenced that we received from the Board of Health, Mary Savage Dunham organized a meeting. Well, we met this past summer, Mary and I met with each of the department heads, but then again this morning, Mary and I received their verbal comments from Sue Sarney from the Board of Health, and Kristen Napoli from Fire, and Emily Wentworth from Zoning, and Mike Clancy. And so we talked about a lot of the issues that have been discussed tonight, and so we'll be able to speak to those at least from their perspective, but we can always go back, obviously, if needed, and get more input from them as we move forward. Okay, so when we look at the purpose of the zoning bylaw, the proposed amendment, It talks about amending Section 3A to insert a subsection, accessory dwelling units within an existing single-family dwelling to be permitted by special permit, so that's the first thing to think about, that we're requiring special permit, in Residence District A, Residence District B, C, D, E, and then Business District A and Business District B, and prohibited in all other zoning districts. And then there's a comment that, this is a Susan Murphy comment, that should we think about, that we're talking about existing grandfathered single-family dwellings within the Business A and Business B districts. So I think, I'm speaking simply for myself at this point, but I think special permit probably is the right mechanism for our town to contemplate allowing an accessory dwelling unit. I will just remind everyone that in the future, this could become as of right. So I say that only to remind us to, as we march through it, to think about, okay, what if this were as of right someday in the future? If the state legislation as proposed presently were to pass.
One other comment that I'd have on that is, in terms of, I look at the zoning bylaw as its fundamental purpose also is to protect the abutters. And so I'm thinking of a context in any one of the residence districts where if somebody would object to the transition from a single family to a single family allowing an accessory dwelling unit within, and that person was burdened in a negative way, what kind of redress would they have? Now, and let's say we look at two kinds of neighborhoods. There's a neighborhood where the houses were built before 1940, which ironically is along most of the old byways in the town. And the houses are a slightly different character and configuration. Some might say more easily accommodating an accessory dwelling unit than, for example, the other kinds of neighborhoods, which were the neighborhoods that were produced in conjunction with and as a result of the 1941 bylaw, which fundamentally is single-family zoning. And I look at neighborhoods like Liberty Pole, or I look at subdivision or cul-de-sac kinds of neighborhoods where typically the houses look a little bit different. I'm thinking, if you were to put an ADU in an 8-room older house, it might be easier assimilated along an older house, whereas in a ranch house in Liberty Pole, if you put an accessory dwelling unit in, and if the premise is that you weren't going to change the size of the house, which means you really weren't going to add any more rooms to the house, you have a very different situation. And I'm just thinking of it in terms of neighbors and abutters. What kind of redress would a neighbor have now if they were legitimately aggrieved by something like this? And I'm saying for legitimate reasons, not spite or anything like that, legitimate reasons like parking or headlights or whatever, or density or encroachment on their property. So under a special permit, and let's say if the special permit were in the grandfathered houses, because they're already grandfathered, pre-1941, versus the context of looking at it as a variance. Right now, if someone wants to do something that is not allowed by right within the bylaw, for example, wanting to put a garage in their front yard in a certain area of town where this isn't necessarily allowed, you could get a variance for that. If an abutter was aggrieved on the issuance of a variance, the abutter could appeal, and typically the abutter prevails in a variance appeal. Whereas in a special permit process, if the abutter appeals, they don't necessarily prevail. And so I just look at it as it's really an enforcement issue. How do you basically protect the abutters, and what kind of an instrument would have to be put in this
Susan, or Mary.
to allow that?
If I may, so a dimensional variance is a little different animal than a use variance. And I know dimensional variances, that's a great point. The burden of proof is on the applicant if there's a problem. But use variances are
It's the same.
not granted
well, they're not granted very often in Hingham.
Yeah.
But the statutory criteria are the same.
But I'm just thinking,
not- I mean-
what kind of redress would an abutter have under a special permit process if they were legitimately not in favor of this conversion?
Well, the special permit is a hearing, same, right, were you doing a?
I mean, yeah, so I think you raised a really good point, and I think a variance, in terms of butter protection, a variance is always better than a special permit. But over my time on the board, because we do site plan review with A2s, there is like an extra layer sometimes of protection, right? So you've got the zoning board making an A2 determination. And the fact that you have another board composed of 5 people, elected people, right, and ZBAs like that, who can come in and say, okay, part of our site plan review criteria, which is pretty comprehensive, requires we can condition certain things. There is almost like an extra layer of protection there within our permitting process,
This
which
is
I
proposed,
think.
Bill, as an A1.
Oh, A1, okay,
Yeah.
so I was an A2.
Yeah, so we can talk about that.
So maybe, I mean, one of the things we could do is incorporate site plan review into it. As an
ZBA
extra
does
layer.
site plan review with an A1, it's just that they do it, you don't. They kind of handle it all.
But wouldn't
The
we
overlap
wanna-
of the 2 boards is
but
always
wouldn't
good,
wanna-
I think.
I like the idea of the overlap of the boards, and if you do an A1, special permit site plan review, there are conditions, I think we should have it in the bylaw, that it's required, that the site plan review is required.
If it were an A2.
I mean, I would put it in.
If it's A2, automatically would be required, right?
Yeah.
So if it's an A1.
So what are we saying here? We're saying just A1 in the language, why don't we add A2? Just so that it's
Because the
required.
A2 deals with use, right?
Do you have a reaction to that, Susan, in terms of
Well,
process or?
no, I would just, obviously, it's a policy question for the
Yeah.
board. I think maybe a useful exercise would to be 2 things. The first one, look at what the site plan criteria are and see if, they're really kind of, that's the type of situation you think it was designed to address. And also look at the other uses in the zoning bylaw that are A1 versus A2 and say, in the scheme of our bylaw structure, where does this best fit in? And then the board, make a determination.
So what if we agree, just to put a pin in that thought as something, that's a good point, let's think about it as we go through it,
Yeah.
and then revisit it. And Mary, will you help us keep track of, all the things that will be,
Yeah.
I suspect there'll be many things we'll be looping back to?
Our pin list.
The pin list.
Jen, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
You mentioned that this, if the state makes, a law that says this could become as of right, it still would be that if we have protections in place, that those protections would,
It's unclear, there are some, go ahead.
No, if the zoning reform act were to pass with this section, the way it reads today, it's no zoning ordinance or bylaw shall prohibit or require a special permit or the use of land or structures for an accessory dwelling unit, and then it has about page and a half of the minimum requirements that would be required and what the bylaw can address. So it does give towns some ability to regulate certain aspects of it, but it would basically void any special, for anything beyond this. So this is, as of right, you could have on a 5,000 square foot or larger lot, or a lot sufficient for Title V, you could have a dwelling unit that was no greater than, not larger than half the floor area or 900 feet, whichever is smaller. So they have their own criteria, and like I said, there's certain requirements that the bylaw could provide, but as long as it met this criteria, they wouldn't be required to have any permits.
and any idea of the time frame on that?
It's been sitting there for years and years and years. It could be this year, it could be 10 years from now.
It has increased momentum this year as it
Yeah.
has in the past.
Yeah.
There's
So-
been a lot of attention.
But it's,
I guess what I was hearing on that is that the Senate was very much in favor of these changes, whereas the House is not. And so,
Traditionally.
I'm not sure it'll
And does that
pass.
include
Right, no, and we,
attached or just attached?
Right.
Just attached.
right.
All right,
We
thanks.
can't know if it will pass, but it's good to know what's potentially out there. Okay, what about the issue that Susan asks about if we mean, within Business District A and Business District B, do we mean only the grandfathered single-family dwellings in that, and should we call that out here? That's the point of your
Right,
comment.
and the reason now I'm raising that, and if you look at 3A, there's a little history to the way, Sarah, you and I are like, have the institutional memory here, but there's a little reason, not a little reason, why 3A, Section 1 on residential is worded the way it is right now. So under there's a 1.8 with a heading for all the accessory uses. This used to be worded differently, and a developer argued years ago that the way it was worded, they could have an accessory dwelling unit as a primary use as long as there was a home office because it was in the downtown business district. And at the time, town council agreed with that interpretation, although the planning board didn't necessarily agree with that interpretation. So the planning board went to town after that happened, where there were residential units built in the downtown, it wasn't an overlay district at the time, but in the downtown, in a non-residential district, it was reworded to make it clear that they were accessory. So my recommendation is that if you're going to put it as an allowed use, that you might want to have a special condition, that it's only in pre-existing single-family dwellings in order to not potentially open a unintended crack, that now you have a dwelling unit as accessory to, now in the downtown, you can have the units, above, but you have an overlay district that kind of controls where the residential will go, so, but there's a handful of single family still in the business districts. So it's just if you want to be clear.
Okay.
So Susan, on that, right now, if you have a commercial building that is essentially a residential structure and configuration in the downtown overlay district, once it goes from residential to commercial, it can't be converted back to residential.
Right, but there's a number of homes that are there, and those homes may wish to have an accessory dwelling unit if this is adopted.
My question is, under this interpretation, could, if you were going to do an accessory dwelling unit in one of those structures and you were going to convert it to residential, wanting to convert it to residential, you could put the ADU in it on the second floor if it's a commercial building, but you couldn't have it as a primary residence with an ADU. If you wanted to convert the structure from commercial to residential and put an ADU on the second floor, could you do that under the ADU proposed bylaw?
I'm sorry, I don't know if I'm following you. You're talking about an existing commercial building?
Existing building that's currently commercial in
Right.
use, but was built as a residence, and someone
Right.
would want to, let's say, convert it back into a residence with an ADU on the second floor. Right now, they could put the ADU.
You can't do that without a use variance. You can't, if something's a commercial use in a business district currently, it can't be converted to back to a single-family home in the business district
Except
without
by
a use
variance.
variance. Yeah.
Okay.
So,
All right.
unless someone disagrees, do you want to propose language for us, maybe?
Well, what I would suggest is that this is in the use table. So, Mary, would this be a new line? Oh, this is in 1.8.9?
Yeah.
It might be subject to special condition 11, but that assumes the time, place, and manner passes. So I think I just have to think about how you would number that special condition for the warrant article purposes, because it may be that we have to have language, and John Coughlin approves all the warrant article forms, so I just need to talk to him about it. Because it may need to be as, after the then last, it may have to be language to be,
Right. It might, move.
Right.
It might move.
It
based
may
on what
be
happens
10,
in
it may
town.
be 11, it all depends on whether the other article.
But we could draft up,
passes, what the language
we
is.
could prepare track changes of how it would look in here, if that's what you're asking.
And then, you might want, I didn't, this was the note I had written, but I didn't come prepared to kind of write.
No, I didn't mean you need to do it right now.
Oh, I thought
We're not, no, I'm just saying, can we
I
put
thought you were
that on
like,
our
oh, you
list?
want me
that
to
you'll-
spot draft this for you?
No, absolutely
Yeah,
not.
we'll pin it, you'll
Put it on the
pin it.
list, Mary.
All right, put it on the
Thank
list.
you. Okay, so then the next topic there is the purpose. And the purpose that Gary's work group put forward is, the purpose of permitting accessory dwelling units in existing dwellings is to, A, provide small additional dwelling units without adding to the number of buildings in the town or substantially altering the appearance of the town, and for the purpose of enabling owners of single-family dwellings to share space and the burdens of home ownership. B, eliminate unpermitted accessory dwelling units and enable the town to monitor construction for code compliance. And C, protect stability, property values, and residential character of the surrounding neighborhood. There are a couple of comments there, one from staff, review the purpose statements in the model bylaw and consider wordsmithing this section. And then Susan has a comment, also recommended that the board review purpose and intent provisions set forth in the model bylaw and like town bylaws. But does anyone want to start with thoughts on this purpose, how we feel about it?
I think I might add something which is in the model bylaw and also in Concord's bylaw. We did discuss it, but somehow it didn't get in the draft. That we should also provide units for persons with disabilities. We also had a discussion on the study committee on providing housing for adult children, which seems to be a significant need in the town right now,
So number 4 from the model bylaw.
is providing housing units for persons with disabilities.
Disabilities
Yeah.
and adult children.
And then perhaps adult children.
Or should we just say millennials?
That's excellent. Okay. Anything else substantively?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of the other conversations we're going to have are going to flow from this, right?
We're going to get this right.
We can table it and come back to it as we get to the other questions about rent and various other things, but what's in the purpose is going to define a lot of the answers to the really difficult questions I think that some of us had coming in and then were added to substantially tonight already, right? This is, I now know why we've been at this for 20 years, but I think that, some of the other bylaws that have been, I think, reviewed by Gary's committee and others, I mean, they cover a fair amount of territory when they get to the purpose as far as defining what they're trying to accomplish and what they're not. So I think we should talk a bit about the purpose now, but I think we need to keep coming back to it as we kind of work our way through the draft bylaw and bump up against some of the questions that Peter and Judy and others have raised tonight, because I think
I agree with you, Gordon. I'm wondering if on C, we could say protect stability, property values, and residential character of abutters and surrounding neighborhood, and that would get to one of Gary's concerns about protecting,
Yep,
direct abutters.
yeah, I like that.
One of the aspects in the Concord bylaw, which the committee thought, our study committee thought was one of the best bylaws.
Which one, Gary?
The Concord zoning bylaw,
Mary handed it
which, the handout is 2 pages from it. We thought was a really good bylaw. And what's implied in this bylaw, which I think a number of us on the committee thought, was that in terms of purpose, and I'll just get to it here in a second. Basically, under 4.2.2.2 in the Concord bylaw, for the purpose of providing small additional dwelling units to rent, without adding to the number of buildings in the town, or substantially altering the appearance of the town, And for the purpose of enabling owners of single-family dwellings larger than required for their present needs to share space in the burdens of home ownership. I think what's implied, that was one of the strongest pieces in the Concord bylaw, because what's implied is you're not going to expand the size of the houses. You're going to basically work within the size of the house to create flexibility of residential units. And I think that's something that I see as key in terms of looking at the different neighborhood characteristics in the town. A ranch house in a single-family neighborhood is going to be a different kind of a configuration to accommodate an ADU than as a larger 7 or 8 room older house along the byways. And it's more than just where the doors are and where the mailboxes are, it's the character. And what I'm concerned about is that also in the Concord bylaw, they don't put in the reference to economics. And I think we should delete that in our purpose section where it's the whole issue of obtaining rental income. I don't think we should put it.
I don't think it's in there.
It's in our, I thought it was. There's something in there about economics, but that's a second concern. Let me go back to the first one. And the first one is the character of the neighborhood. If you have 10 houses on a street in a cul-de-sac neighborhood like Liberty Pole, and I use Liberty Pole because I'm very familiar with it, and if 2 of the houses have ADUs in them, the 10-house street is still fundamentally a residential street. If 6 of the houses have ADUs in them, the street's no longer residential, and it's moving towards a commercial property character. Not putting a value judgment on it, but just talking about in terms of neighborhood and perception and how we control what happens here. Whereas if you have areas along the older byways or downtown or other areas of the town where the houses are generally speaking larger and could assimilate an internal configurational change without expanding the size of the house and still look fundamentally like a single-family house. I think it's a lot easier to do with an older large house than it is with a smaller ranch house. I just think it's something to consider in terms of how we approach this in terms of controls. It also, in some respects, kinds of, one of my other concerns in this is, do we just have a general statement here of the different residential districts? Because they're all different. And we're treating them like they're the same. Should we have different criteria? I mean, for example, downtown has smaller lot sizes. Would you say basically that the lot size is the lot size required in the residential district, rather than put a common denominator on the lot size of 10,000 square feet, where downtown most of the lots are 4,000, or they could be 5,000. But you wouldn't want to have a 5,000 minimum square foot lot in a residence district B or C, which is 30,000 square feet. It doesn't make sense.
All right, so Gary,
Look at this map, there's not a considerable amount of lots that are less than 10,000 square feet, so it's
I'm just thinking of,
like,
I don't know what the right size is, but I'm just wondering, my point is more one size doesn't fit all the districts.
okay, so I think I'm hearing that you want us to, at some point, go back to item 1 and reevaluate if we really mean all of those residence districts, or if we want to modify that. But sticking with the purpose, which is where we were, I compared the Concord bylaw to the proposed purpose here, and I noticed that the one that your committee put forward actually didn't have the language about the larger than required for their present needs. So are you suggesting you want to add that in?
I'd like to add that in, yeah.
And I also noticed that where it says provide small additional dwelling units in the first few words of A, in Concord they say to rent, and this one currently does not. So I just wanted to
I wouldn't put to
raise
rent.
that. Well, this is an issue that we'll, we will be addressing, but
Right.
I'm just pointing out that it's not in here at the moment, and we need to, I don't know that we've decided whether they're going to be, what we mean by that, but we may want to go
and
back.
have we sort of discussed whether it's just for relatives, and we sort of talked about the in-law versus general
The chief brought it up, there are 3 or 4 of the towns that specifically reference that it's got to be a family, and then
Yep.
defines what that is within a relatively narrow construct, so.
Right, so that's something we
you
need
know,
to decide.
I think that's, the chief brought it up, and that then flows to a whole bunch of the rest of it.
So I guess proof of family relationship would be part of the special permitting process,
Mary,
right?
the town, you worked in a town that operated that way, is that right? Or that Connecticut
I
town?
worked in a town that, we had an in-law apartment, it was not an accessory dwelling unit.
Right.
So it was primarily targeted to in-laws, and when it was a special permit, and we required an affidavit from the applicant stating that they would never offer it for rent, they understood that it was, for this relation, and when this person moved on to somewhere else, if they wanted to have someone else move in, they had to come back to the board.
And they had to submit that affidavit every year or something, right? Wasn't it?
No.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Not that I recall, but it was a number of years ago. I will say that what tends to happen over time, or at least there, is that when the house is sold, the realtors would come in and say, oh, is this a two-family? Or is this, and that's when we'd say, oh, no, that's an accessory unit, and if it's going to be, continue to be used as an accessory unit, the new owner needs to return to the board to get another special permit. And then typically, that was a 6-week process at least, and when someone's getting ready to close on a property, if that's a deal breaker, that used to create a lot of angst, I will say.
And that kind of required family relationship.
It did require it,
But that kind of goes to Mr. Patsy's point about we or they are making permanent decisions relative to the housing unit for what may be an episodic need,
correct,
right?
correct.
So, then what?
So,
I mean, I think if I was to support this, I think I would want that. Because I think Deirdre made the point about, these commonly would be used for an aging parent or,
What about an au pair, though, or,
Yeah, that's a good point,
I
yeah.
mean, a butler, or...
A butler. Unfortunately.
Problem I don't have.
I won't have any, I don't have a butler. A butler, yeah. No, that's right, yeah,
I think we also
but,
need to take a look, and I'll report back at fair housing laws. I'll tell you, many bylaws going, because they've carried it since the 1940s, for example, have a definition of family, which does not comport with the modern family.
That's tricky.
And it is often unenforceable, and I don't know whether it would be enforceable in this context, because you'd have to define family.
Right.
And in many contexts, the definition of family in local zoning bylaws is being thrown out by court. So I think that's a potential, I think it's just a potential, you could have an issue just trying to get through the AG's office, but I can look into that.
Okay.
The other issue is enforceability, because who's knocking on the door to say, show me your family tree? And, right? Okay, so, and is that really something that the board
Is that what we do?
wants?
Right.
Wants the building commissioner and his staff to be doing, or neighbors?
well, there's only so much you can do.
Reporting,
The
right.
affidavit, potentially the
Right. Yeah.
the reaffirmance of it every couple of years. I mean, only so much you can do if you allow them. I will say that the vast majority of people in the town who've spoken in support of this to me have mentioned it in the context of an aging mother or father.
Right.
Vast majority of people have said that.
One of the things that we found on the committee is that once we put these units out to rent, we can no longer discriminate relative to relationship. The only, we can't really discriminate on much that's outside of the fair housing laws, because now it's subject to landlord-tenant law and the Fair Housing Act. And so we found we couldn't discriminate if it's rented. The only time you can discriminate, if it's a family situation, you can only discriminate under a family criteria if it's not rented. But once it's out to rent, it's in the public sphere for rent, it's fair housing laws, which is a little, I was surprised when I read that. And I was surprised at how little under the fair housing laws you can discriminate. You can't set up private constructs like this. If you're renting it, you're subject to landlord-tenant law. even though it's an ADU.
So knowing that, then how do you think we should address that here?
Well, I think that we should have, I'm not totally sure I know exactly how to address it, but I think there are two different situations here. There's the intent, which is to have this for adult children or aging parents or nuclear families, which to me is very consistent and not controversial. And then there's the other side of this where you set it up for a 1 or 2 year, 5-year situation with a family member, and that family situation changes, and now it's a commercial property, which is the reason why the committee recommended doing the review of the special permit every 3 years, is because it recognizes that it's going to change. And if you don't have a review on it, you're not going to catch the change. There's no accountability. So, I don't know. I don't know the answer to
So
that
you think the
one, but-
3-year expiration is part of addressing that, in any case? Okay.
Can I just want to ask practical questions, right?
Yes,
This is just,
good.
I'm just throwing
Please
stuff
do.
out there as like
Yep.
devil's
Go for it.
advocate for the board to bounce around. Someone renovates their house to, in whatever way, to create the accessory apartment. It's, the elderly mother's living there. At some point, she passes away. They now have this separate area of their house.
Yep.
And what happens to it if they don't have another family member to move into it?
Right. And this
Right.
goes to Judy's point earlier, that this is a big
I-
investment in your home.
Again, I'm saying, you're
Significant.
talking to I mean, I'm just speaking to, practicalities and enforcement. I'd be curious, because there is a list, and I've been trying to find the reference in the zoning bylaw, that's why I've been searching online, and because we were dealing with this less than 6 months ago, we were at the zoning board, on a house that burned down that was being rebuilt. There's a list on file in the building department that's referenced somewhere in the bylaw, that has at least a couple of dozen, it may even be more, 3-4 dozen, grandfathered, two-family, kind of accessory dwelling unit type. They have them as two families, but not all of them are. I used to own one of them that was the grandfather, but it was really just an accessory dwelling unit in name, in fact, the way it operated. But, I'd be curious for all of those that we know are legal, right? So those, forgetting the illegal ones that are definitely out there, there are a few dozen at least, legal grandfathered, two-family / single-family with accessory apartments. How are, you can't knock on people's doors, but I think people might have a sense, if they look at the addresses, well, that one's vacant right now, or, yeah, that one has the grandmother living there, or no, they just have a tenant in it. I think it might be helpful to try to get a sense of how they're being used. But, I think people will say it's great for their family, because I think, as Ms. Anderson indicated, that's how people, I know when we first moved into that house, and we don't live there anymore, so I don't have any stake in this one, and it was grandfathered anyway, we were thinking, if my father-in-law had just passed away, maybe if my mother-in-law declined, it would be a good place for her. But, there's many illegal ones throughout the town, where some have family members, but some have rented, and some have the au pair in it. So, I think it's a cross-section across the town of how it's being used. So the one other kind of factual piece of information that I want to give you is, back, I was still on the planning board, so it has to be at least 7, 8, but I want to say it's even 10 years ago now. There was an issue that kept recurring in the building department, because people would come in for a building permit, or maybe they were selling their house, a similar situation, and the broker would go into the building department and say, is that a legal two-family? And the building commissioner would say, wait a minute, if it hasn't been used in 2 years and that use has expired, and make people prove that there were, water bills or tax, all this different evidence, or a lease, and prove that it hadn't been abandoned or gone without use for 2 years, And if they couldn't prove it, then he'd say, okay, you can't use it anymore. And what happened is that happened frequently enough that people came to the planning board and said, that's crazy because I've got this legal grandfathered apartment and I'm not allowed to use it anymore. And the non-conforming use section of our bylaw now says that if you have a pre-existing legal kind of two-family or accessory unit, it never becomes it never expires. So that 2 years of non-use or abandoned use doesn't apply. So if you had the grandmother there and she passes away and it's vacant for a few years, well then your child now graduates college, they can move in. Or you need the income because it's a grandfathered legal apartment with no other regulations on it, you can rent it to anyone. So, you know, we have a situation where there's all these hybrids going on in the town because there's at least, I don't know, I want to say it's 30, 40, 50 grandfathered legal apartments. There's a number of two families, I'm not sure how many, there's not that many of those in the town. And then you have however many, and I don't know how anyone confirms the number of the illegal. So those are the kind of the facts of what's happening in the town, and I don't know how that plays into your thoughts about how, you know, if you were going to support this bylaw, you would want it to read, but there's a lot of questions about, you know, depending on the year, the time, the house, neighbors next to neighbors having different rights.
So I guess a question is, and maybe backing into it a little bit, talking about whether it's restricted to family or not, what are the impacts that restriction is intended to mitigate? You know, already one side is owner occupied, so if it wasn't family versus it is family, what would be the perceived risk or impacts, and then could you mitigate that somehow in here?
Right. That's what I was just thinking, because I hear Bill when he says, you know, the conversations you have with folks about this generally is a grandmother or an adult child with disabilities. And it is when you start to contemplate, there's something it just feels different when the person on the other side of the wall is not related to you and they pay rent. Is it really different in terms of, you know, your neighbor's experience? Maybe, maybe not. But, right, for example, like you just said, if we're requiring it to be, for one thing, owner occupied, in theory, that mitigates some of that, because if you're living next to this person and you're there and you're dealing. So I think your point is a good one. We need to think about, if we're going to allow rentals, we're going to think about if we're requiring, doesn't sound like we have answers to these things at the moment, but again, if you could keep tabs of these things that we need to keep looping back to, and as we march through it, we see if it's mitigated, and if we feel as though we've come up with something that is limited in a way that works. I don't know if you feel comfortable moving forward with that.
I think that'd be helpful. I'd also like to get a better understanding of, there are right now, as of right, permitted ADUs in pre-1941 houses, and there are, as of right, permitted two families in pre-1941 houses. So that's on the commercial side of the house, so those are already there. They shouldn't really
They're not necessarily commercial,
impact.
though. You keep saying commercial, but it's not necessarily rental income, right?
No, these are rentals. Once it's rental, it's commercial. If it's family,
It's still a residential use.
It's a residential use.
It's a
but
residential use.
It's a commercial business occupancy when the two families of business.
Yeah, it's a
single families
residential
are
use.
residents. But, in splitting hairs, but I think my point is that there's a certain number of those that are already legal, and there's a certain number of those that are illegal. I'd like to understand the difference as to why one is legal versus one isn't. Is it a function of the date, the grandfather?
Gotta be the
Or is it
date.
a function that it never had a permit? So it's really the ones that never got a permit that are the ones that are the illegal ones, right?
Well, if somebody was pre-1941, why wouldn't they get a permit? They just didn't want to get a permit.
Yeah, I mean,
because unless they, you know, unless they say, I might get a permit, I'm doing my own thing.
They're already
There's so many, right.
And again, I don't think 1941 is a key date. I think it was changed, and I want to say it was in the 50s.
Yeah.
There was two families were allowed, and then in the 50s, they became not allowed, and there was, that's when but there was a grandfathering, the conversion came in if you were pre-1941. So, the reason why they're legal or not legal is they may have pre-existed zoning, or they existed prior to the zoning changing in the 50s, or they were a permitted two-family conversion. But I'd say of those three categories, the only ones that were permitted were post-1950s two-family conversions are the ones with permits. All the other ones were pre-existing, and that's why they're legal. So that's kind of how the and then the illegal ones are just ones that have been created post the 1950s change with, no permits of any kind, so.
Okay.
I have a non-substantive issue. I just don't like the name accessory dwelling unit.
What do you want to call it?
Yeah. So I'm thinking
That counts as
about,
non-substantive after all.
so I'd just like to throw that out there. So I'm going to be looking for
Do you have a
different
new
names.
idea?
No, I don't.
You're the
I'm just
teacher.
going to throw it, I'll think about it.
Granny Plat?
Exactly. There you go, I like it.
Sometimes call it Granny Plat. I didn't even make that up.
I don't like the name either, actually. When you hear the name ADU, you think of the unattached, right?
Exactly, that's
I always thought
exactly
of
why.
unattached.
Yep.
That's, detached from
marketing
from
issue.
primary, but.
Madam Chair, if I could also just, in the public comment related to purpose, we did hear that one potential purpose could be looking towards smart growth, development, a more sustainable community.
Yep.
Supporting transit-oriented development. And so I just put that back
Yeah.
out there as you think about
So
purpose.
think about it.
I mean, I just would like to say something as someone who, I don't use the train to get to work, but I just don't think that it's possible to really live in the town of Hingham and not have a car, even though I live within walking distance and could potentially take the train. It's just, there's just, so I don't think you can say that in areas that are near transit, people won't need cars. I just think we need cars, in this town. Because if you're close to the train, you're not close to the market. You're still a mile and a half away from the market, or a mile away from the market. So anyway, not necessarily with the boat, but I'd just like to,
Yeah.
I don't see proximity to public transportation as a parking relief issue. I think that's disingenuous to think that people won't need a car to live in the town of Hingham. I just think we do.
Okay, so thinking of it another way, and I'm just thinking out loud, if we did put something, let's say we did put something in the purpose saying we wanted to promote them in these types of areas, Granny Flats, in these types of areas, would it, so I think maybe your point is a fair one about the parking relief, but would there be other benefits to including it, is kind of what I'm asking. In other words, would it make the decision, would you be more inclined to say yes in certain areas if something were missing, or?
The only place I could see that would be feasible would be the shipyard, right? Because you do have proximity to a market and to public transportation. There is nowhere else in town where that is the case.
And, right, so you're assuming the benefit is the person doesn't own a car, as opposed to just they don't need to use their car.
Right, yes, yeah. If that's what you're saying, it's close to public transportation, your assumption is that means they're using public transportation.
Well,
And
there are bus lines that run through town and go to the supermarkets. People do that all the time.
Just the northern part.
Well,
Yeah, not that,
Not
they
that
don't,
much.
I don't think that, I don't know very many people who go in market and take the bus. You see a
Well,
little
that's
bit
fair. I guess I don't know
by
that.
Station Street,
My
but-
groceries delivered.
I think the...
I don't know, I just don't see, it's not an easy thing. It's not, something that you could say, I'm just gonna give up my car and use public transportation in the town, and, it would take a big commitment, in terms of walking and transporting things, except if you live in the shipyard. That's the only place I can see that you could legitimately sort of get away with not having a car.
I think, Sarah, that in the context that I've heard the sustainable growth, it's been intermodal, meaning there's more than one transportation option. But I agree with you. I think that, it's been discussed in the master plan discussions about, West Hingham, development adjacent to West Hingham is intermodal because you have more than one transportation option, but you don't have the other aspects that you have at the shipyard. You have the intermodal aspects, but you also have the mixed-use aspects, so it makes a lot of sense. That also, I think, was part of the concern I had about which districts do we put this in? Should this be more favorable in a district like the Shipyard, where you do have those other options?
I mean, I think if our purpose is to sort of help people economically, which is where the sort of in-law or not comes into play too, you know, enabling single to share space and the burdens of home ownership, that's not necessarily an in-law issue. I mean, I think I think it would have to be all over town, because I think that everybody could be in need of putting this in. I don't think we could say only, you know, Residence District A is in need of this kind of relief. I think, you know, we have heard from lots of people that that this is something they would like. I agree with Bill and Jen that we primarily hear about it in relation to a family member. But I think we also hear about people wanting to stay in their house and being able to rent out some, you know, older people staying in their house and renting out some to other, you know, to gain income, to be able to stay and pay the taxes. So, I mean, I honestly don't believe that it's something that we should consider in different residents. I think it should be everywhere or not at all. I don't see a reason to say no in this and yes in that.
Yeah, no, I would agree. I was thinking more of the sustainable aspect of it, Sarah. One of the things we did see in the demographic studies that we did, that the MAPC prepared, is that 40% of the town is senior citizens, so that lends itself to the discussion of the adult children and also being able to stay in your house when you're looking at a fixed income, and being able to afford to still stay in this town, which is, I think, a major concern that a lot of people have.
Yeah. Well, and one thing to remember, based on both Sarah and your comment, Gary, right now, is that the way it's drafted currently, owner-occupied could mean in either the primary unit or the accessory dwelling unit.
Yep.
So then it does then come back to our question that we need to loop back to about, say, the elderly person wants to move into the smaller unit. Can they rent out the rest of the house? I mean, you know, that's something we need to be cognizant of as part of this discussion. Okay.
And I've heard that in the context of children basically taking over the larger house.
Right.
And the
Yeah.
parents living in the
makes
smaller
sense.
portion of the unit, but that assumes a family connection.
Right.
So maybe we put that in as a
Yeah.
But
requirement.
even if you're older and want to move into the smaller and rent out the larger to a large family, I mean, I think as Jen said, that proximity of someone living with a shared wall is different than a detached unit. You know, you really have to, you know, be comfortable with that situation, I think. I mean, I wouldn't say that it would have to be a family member. I mean, I'm not, I don't know. I can see that if it's an economic reason, then the elderly couple could move into the smaller unit and rent out the larger to a growing family. It's not related to them,
Right.
so.
Well, right, and your point, going back to what I said before, it's the exact opposite of an absentee landlord, right? Because the landlord, the
Yeah.
owner is right there
Yeah.
living next to, yeah. Okay. Let's see. So both Mary and Susan recommended to us that we look at the model bylaws, which we did, and then other zoning bylaws for the purpose, which we looked at Concord. Do you think there's anything else we should look at this point to think about purpose? Mary or Susan?
I agree, you'll have to keep coming back to it.
Yeah.
And look at the rest of the bylaw through the lens, the purpose, and make sure that they interrelate.
Okay. Definitions, that's the next section. The definition right now is an accessory dwelling unit, or insert new name here, is a second self-contained dwelling unit, subordinate in size, so that's important, to the principal dwelling on a lot and incorporated within the principal dwelling. And then principal dwelling is defined. A principal dwelling, for the purposes of this section, shall be a single-family dwelling. And then it says, a single-family dwelling with an accessory dwelling unit shall not be deemed to be a two-family dwelling. And then we have a comment from Susan that says she recommends that the board consider mirroring the definition of ADU contained in the same form in both the Senate and House zoning reform bills. So we don't need to jump to that comment immediately, but does anyone have a reaction or thoughts on these definitions?
Maybe this is invoking new guy privilege. Self-contained dwelling unit is,
You get that?
that's a term of art that presumes kitchen and all
Dwelling
the
unit is
utilities.
a defined term in the zoning
Self-contained dwelling
bylaw.
unit?
No, dwelling unit is a defined term in the zoning bylaw. So, one or more rooms providing complete living facilities for one household, including rooms and facilities for living, sleeping, eating, cooking, and sanitation. So that's what, I'm withdrawing my comment because the legislation kind of gets into, I don't like it when substantive terms are in definitions. And in the legislation, they get very substantive in their definition, and I don't think that's the best drafting practice.
So what don't you like,
So I-
Susan?
So, for example, Susan, just out of curiosity, what was the substantive, I agree with you, I've read that, but I was just curious as to which one you're pointing out.
So it says an accessory dwelling unit shall mean a self-contained housing unit inclusive of sleeping, cooking, and sanitary facilities incorporated within the same structure as the principal dwelling unit that, 1, maintains a separate entrance either directly from the outside or through an entry hall or corridor shared with the principal dwelling sufficient to meet the requirements of the state building code for safe egress. 2, shall not be sold separately from the principal dwelling, and 3, is not larger in floor area than half the floor area of the principal dwelling, or 900 square feet, whichever is smaller. So you've got the definition with the substance.
That's a lot of
I
substance.
understand
We
that.
can-
There's one point in there that seems relevant that we don't have in ours, which is that won't be sold separately from the primary unit.
Does that go to the
That's
condo
in the condo
provision?
conversion, right?
That goes to the
But maybe-
condo
But
conversion.
that might be a different way to word it.
I think
in
that's a key
4F.
point to put in there.
No
That this-
condominium
that
conversion.
the accessory
is
dwelling unit will not be
permitted.
sold separately from the primary unit.
Well, right.
4F.
That's under
4F.
F, where we
It's
said in
4F,
the committee,
yeah.
no condominium conversion is permitted.
I
But
think it might be
that's what
better
we
to
were
be more
intending.
general.
I think
the
that,
general language is better from the bylaw because this presumes condominium.
So
yeah,
just say it shall not be sold separately.
yeah, I just think that's
Yeah,
better
I
stated.
think that's right.
So that's broader than calling it a
Yes.
condo.
Yeah.
Yes. I think that's what we intended.
Okay. Any other thoughts on definitions? Mary, do you have thoughts on the definitions?
Not at this time.
Okay.
The other thing that, I don't know if it's a definition issue or if it's an additional requirement issue, it's, and the committee felt very strongly that the primary dwelling's utilities be the only utilities serving the structure, and that the ADU's utilities came off the primary residence's utilities. If they were separate utilities, it's a
Oh, that's
two-family.
good.
So this came up in our meeting this morning also with Sue Sarney, and it is addressed, I know it is in here. It's in 5H. All utilities serving the accessory dwelling unit shall be extensions of utilities serving the principal single-family dwelling. We can jump ahead to that now, or we could fill you in on what Sue said when we get to this. What do you think? Let's see. I think staff recommended clarifying that to say water and sewer utilities?
And we were thinking that
Recollection.
gas and telephone clearly could be separate, or Comcast, but anything to do with heating or anything to do with, water.
Hot water.
The
or
way that Mike
sanitary.
Clancy explained it today is, and I'm probably going to get some of this wrong, so I'm paraphrasing, but depending on how many bedrooms, sometimes it can impact the size of the pipes that are required for the new portion. So if you created an ADU and that, now if you're on sewer, now you might need bigger pipes. So that was going to potentially have to be separate utility. And additionally, sometimes, and I am not good with the building code at all, there could be a need for an additional burner, a furnace, he said, depending on the layout and the.
With
So
an addition, if the
he was
existing furnace
coming up with
couldn't handle
reasons
it.
that it was
Yeah, you have to need-
But all,
sometimes.
you could put in supplemental heating system, but you'd still have a primary oil and gas feed for it.
Utilities.
Now, the other way that you could do it is that all utilities are paid by the primary homeowner. So in
Well,
other
this
words,
gets to the
it's-
rental issue, which we haven't
Right,
addressed,
but then-
right? So you're going down the, like, we're definitely not rent it path, right? When you're,
Yeah,
we should not say.
Well, I'm saying that, that either case, if you have separate utilities, it's no longer a single-family residence,
Why is that?
because you have two separate bills. And in order to maintain this as
Oh,
a
no.
single-family residence, a lot of the other bylaws have that in there specifically, that it's the one set of utilities because it's a single-family house.
I think the key is if they cannot be sold separately, then it's one, then it's a, one dwelling unit.
With an accessory use.
So, for example, if you have a side-by-side two-family, which we have a number of those in Hingham in certain areas, those could be sold separately. If you have triple deckers, sometimes, a lot of times those are done as rental.
Yep.
But more often they're condoized, and you can, I think the key in if trying to, from a legal standpoint, manage there's a primary owner, and that's the owner occupant, is that it can never be sold separately from the as two separate units. It is, and Sue's memo speaks a little bit to this, or directly to this. I mean, there are sanitary code and there's state landlord-tenant laws with respect to what services have to be provided by the landlord, which ones
Yes, she
you
went over
can
that.
charge, have separately metered and charged to your tenant. So,
But under-
I mean, for example, Sue says the accessory unit should have their own supply of heat. The occupant is required to supply the fuel under a written letting or leasing agreement. And she quotes to the state regulations. So, I mean, I think the reason for that is, obviously so that the landlord can't cut off heat to a tenant.
Or just turn it down too low, right?
We did discuss today that could mean having a thermostat in the accessory
Right,
unit.
right.
So it doesn't necessarily have to be a brand-new boiler.
Just a
Right,
zone.
But it could be another zone.
Another zone, right.
With the
Right.
control of it
Right,
within
it
the
doesn't
unit.
have to be a separate metered, right.
I think it goes back to in the building code, to the one and two family building code, which talks about, and it's a definition issue of single versus two-family or three-family. It's a function of separate utilities and separate metering. Under definition, if it's separately metered, it's a two-family. If it's not separately metered, it's a single-family. And I'm just concerned about definitions under the unanticipated consequences, because if the definition's in conflict, someone can come in and say, no, it really is a two-family. And we could say all the best of intentions is that it's a subordinate unit within a single, but legally, under definition, it's not. And also in terms of landlord-tenant law, there are certain requirements under a rental situation that have to be complied with, and the definitions are also key. So it's bigger than zoning. It's how you're going to manage and enforce it, and from a business perspective.
So are you suggesting we need
Keep
a
it.
change to this definition section?
I think I'm not sure I'm clear. I'm clear what the change is, but I don't think we're there yet.
Okay.
I also
I
think...
have three possible names.
Oh, good.
Excellent.
You ready?
Let's hear them.
Small interior dwelling unit.
Small interior dwelling, okay.
Just so you know, I Googled ADU thesaurus, so I did come up with these myself. This is my favorite one, but it's Canadian. Garden suite. A small home within a home.
Small home with,
Wait, that's another term?
Yeah, small home within a home.
That's
Yeah.
wordy.
Yeah, sorry, they're a little more wordy. Garden suite is not as wordy, but it does imply a garden.
It does imply a basement apartment.
So
Always
anyway,
known as basement apartments, but
they did have basement apartment, granny apartments, granny flat. These are just the ones that so I'm just, yeah, I'll keep
All right, that's your.
I'll keep searching.
Or Butler's residence.
that'd be interesting.
Butler residence.
That'd be interesting, town meeting, I was speaking in favor.
AKA Mary's name, Butler's residence. What'd you say, Bill?
That'd be interesting, town meeting to get up and say, I was speaking in favor of the small home within a home bylaw.
It's like it's all house.
Covered under the stairs. Covered under the stairs, there you go, that's it, Susan, you found it.
All right,
A literary allusion as well.
good. I think,
Jen, you.
yes, I was just gonna say,
Yeah.
we're getting a little loose. It's 9:30.
Sorry.
No, that's good. I don't mind the loose. I just want to remind everyone that we have a hard stop. Probably by 9:45, we need to talk about what we're doing next. So let's use the next 15-ish minutes. Maybe we can start looking at the eligibility requirements, which is the next section. An accessory dwelling unit may be allowed by special permit A1 issued by the Board of Appeals within a principal dwelling that meets the following minimum requirements. And there are 4 of them. 1, the area of the lot on which the single-family dwelling is located shall not be less than 10,000 square feet. 2, the accessory dwelling unit shall only be permitted in a single-family dwelling for which a final certificate of occupancy was issued at least 2 years prior to an application for said permit, and if no such certificate was issued, which was legally occupied prior to such date. C, only 1 accessory dwelling unit shall be permitted within a single-family dwelling and per lot, so that the total number of dwelling units per lot shall not exceed 2. And 4th, accessory dwelling units shall comply with all applicable state and local regulations and deed restrictions. And then we have some comments that I'll read. This is from Mary. If the lot can provide adequate off-street parking and meet the utility needs, including wastewater, what is the need to reference lot size? Perhaps this requirement should be to demonstrate the availability of adequate utilities and off-street parking, etc. Hingham has many lots less than 10,000 square feet. And then Susan says, many existing single-family homes in North Hingham are less than 10,000 square feet. Recommend that the board discuss and consider questions similar to comment 7.
That's like, no, is that still comment 7? Did you opt it? No, sorry, that's an old reference.
That's an old reference.
So ignore that.
Okay, so we should consider,
If this requires.
Okay, so I think the comment, that was comment 7 in the old, this is in the old, going back to October, November, was, and I guess it gets back to the purpose. And it's not one of the stated purpose, but to the extent that there are existing illegal units, and one of the goals would be for public safety purposes and just general code, building code enforcement, is to have, this is the question, if there's a goal to have those people come forward and have them legally permitted, then if they're already existing in less than 1,000 square feet, they won't, because they'll get shut down. Or you may have new illegal ones created in these lots. I know that definitely the Zoning Reform Act is not perfect in many respects. But to the extent there's a possibility of this, and because this concept is pretty popular these days, so I think of provisions of the Zoning Reform Act, if it was ever to go through, that might survive, particularly where they're identical for both houses of the legislature, this one could survive. So I just, for example, the proposed act has areas not less than 5,000 square feet or on a lot of sufficient area to meet the requirements of Title V. So it kind of gets to both of the concerns. If you're 5,000 square feet, you have to be, and you're on sewer, it may be okay, or at least 5,000 square feet. If you're relying on Title V, you may need a lot more than that. And so, that would be the difference. I guess it just becomes down to a question of particularly Mary's map was very interesting, because you have almost like checkerboard. Like, one house can have, one house is less than 10,000 square feet, the one next to it is over 10,000 square feet, it's like in every other. So, if you're, 5 square feet under, you can't do it, but your next door neighbor can. And at any square footage, you're gonna have that, right?
Well, is that a
But I don't think
uniform
there's not that many, well, I think if you can speak to some sort of,
What's the
public
compelling
health-
reason?
Well, so.
Right, I think it's a.
I feel like I can see both sides of this, right? Because when I hear Sarah, like, I agree with what you said before, which is, if there's a need for this, if we're talking about affordability, and if elders want to age in place, then it doesn't matter how big their lot is, and that might be irrelevant. On the other hand, you could see that, as Gary said earlier, if in a crowded neighborhood, like, some of Otis Hill, or even that neighborhood just adjacent to World's End, or some of these other places, if a lot of people on your block suddenly have one or, an additional car and all these additional people, that's a density issue, and that's a character of the neighborhood in terms of, maybe the house doesn't look too different, but on a small lot, it sort of affects the neighbors more, right, than it does on a bigger lot. So I don't know where I come out on this, but I hear your point that it's kind of an arbitrary number, and what does it mean, and why can your neighbor do it and not you? But I don't know the right way to mitigate it, but I do see the density struggle as well.
Well, I think that in looking at a number of bylaws in surrounding towns, the 10,000 square feet is a typical number. Now, that doesn't mean that it's totally appropriate to what we have. When I look at this map and I see that there aren't a lot of lots that are less than 10,000 square feet, if that's what the green is designating, well, I go back to the idea of the different residential districts have a minimum lot size. So typically, Residence District A has a smaller lot size than C or D. And so could we index this into whatever the size is, a size that's consistent with the character of the neighborhood, the pattern in the neighborhood? So you don't have a situation where somebody comes in and does a Form A lot and subdivides the lot when this goes through. If you have a 40,000 square foot lot and there's a 5,000 square foot minimum, and if you can build a second single-family house and you can put an ADU in that house, I'm looking from a business perspective, unintended consequence, the minimum lot size is in there for a reason. And I don't think we should go down to 5,000 square feet, because that's urban. Because the people who wrote 2420 and S81 live in Boston. They don't live in Hingham. And I think that we have to look at what's important for our specific needs. So I would say we index, I don't think the 10,000 is the one size that fits all. I agree with that. But I also am concerned about the issue of density. And I'm also concerned down the road when 5 years from now, when these accessory dwelling units are lived in by relatives, and the relatives are no longer around, and now they're not related, and it's, what's going to happen down the road, because there are always going to be 2 units in the house.
It sounds to me, though, from what Susan was saying, at least in the relative things, we don't really have a leg to stand on legally necessarily in that, at least, because family is defined so differently. Am I correct, Susan?
Yeah, I'll double check it. But I know that it has become more of an issue in the last couple of decades, where traditional definitions of families that have just existed for decades in zoning bylaws, when there's been a reason to enforce it or attempt to enforce it, have often been, challenged. Now, there's you kind of get a fine line, particularly where it's like, when you say someone can't turn it into a lodging house. So if you say a single family has to be a family living there, so you can't end up having, having, a 5-bedroom house and they're renting it out to 5 different people, is it becoming a lodging house? What I want to do is I just want to look at it so I can just give you the complete information and not be kind of, giving you.
Well, that gets to
I'm not sure
enforcement.
how I feel anyway about it. So,
Well, the rent question gets to that, right? You don't have to design family if you don't allow it to be rented. because nobody's going to give it away for free if they're not related
But
to them.
I know some people who make the
And I'm not saying
family
we should
pay
do that.
rent.
What's that? Well, then, right.
Okay, like, the mother moves in, and then she is contributing to try to help, you know what I mean? So she's not
Yeah,
living
she's
on
not
her
signing
own,
a
or she's not in a
lease.
nursing home, but, you know, there she's kicking in, so,
Well,
or, right, so I think the concept of no rent is also probably not necessarily always the case
Legally
either.
I think if she's short 1 month, though.
Or
she's not
if
getting
you have
thrown
your
out,
adult,
right?
you know,
So-
if you have your college kid moving in to the apartment, well, maybe some parents would let them live for free. I guess I wouldn't be one of those parents.
Most people I know that have done this,
Yeah.
in legal apartments, the parent has downsized. They've
Yeah.
sold the house and they've taken the,
Yeah.
you know, the profits from the house and they've built the addition. They
Mm-hmm.
built the ADU and added onto the house. Generally.
All right. We're not really making a lot of decisions here, but we're marching through nonetheless. I do think it's worth just thinking about your point that the 10,000 square feet or any limitation like that, the 10,000 square feet being an example of a limitation, one of the ways we're trying to limit this, right, is a barrier to the idea of the amnesty. So that's an interesting thing to think about, right? Like, if we do want existing ones to come forward, and they're literally cannot, because they're precluded, then do we need to address, I don't know how we would, but
Well, Mary, is it, I don't know how you determine the, I know you said you use the assessor's records. Can the assessors look for how many are under 7,500 square feet, or how many are?
So I did this
5,000
map
square
just
feet.
using the assessor's data, so we could make any categories that we wanted to. I just picked 10,000 because of this.
that's what it said, yeah.
And to be clear, if it's 10,005, right,
Yeah.
it wouldn't be shaded. Some of these look pretty close, so if you think another
Oh, no, I'm
category
just
is...
asking if, you know, because Jen was saying to the question, like, well, how many are between 5,000 and 10,000 of those green ones, right?
I guess
So you
that
want
would
me
be
to
the-
do...
It might be good to know the next gradation.
Yeah, like, I guess between 5,000, or 7,500, or are any
mean,
of them
what-
under 5,000?
What this map says is that the overwhelming majority of lots are greater than 10,000 square feet, and there's only really 100 lots that are less than 10,000
No,
square
I think
feet.
they're more than that, they're just small.
I mean,
So I guess-
how many lots are green on this map? There aren't very many. Are there 100?
There's a good amount.
I don't think it's more than 100. I mean, there's 6 in South Hingham. I mean,
No, there's more than 6 in South
but
Hingham.
it tells me that
There's 1, 2, 3,
10,000
4.
isn't that
There's
far
like 20 in
off.
South Hingham.
If you were to go to 8,000, you'd probably have, what, 95%? You could also, in an amnesty provision, we could write an amnesty provision that's separate, that's an attachment to this, or part of this, which basically says that, under an amnesty application, the minimum lot size wouldn't necessarily apply, which would, if we wanted to encourage people who've already done this to come in and get their ADUs permitted, you could basically give a relief on some of these prescriptive criteria.
Right.
But that doesn't mean change the criteria for the
Right.
overall town to start.
But so the people who are honest and don't do it might
Okay.
not be able to.
Right, that's more problematic.
That,
Because I'm-
I can hear that already.
But that one's more problematic, because that means
Why
someone
wouldn't
who's
they be able
honest
to?
and
There's
didn't
no
do it
restriction.
can never do it, but someone who's been doing it illegally for 10 years can now
Can
come in
get
and get it
amnesty.
permitted. So I think that's more of a problem.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I just wonder, again, something to think about is, what are we trying to mitigate with the lot size?
Right.
Is it that there's enough parking? Because you have a requirement that you have to provide
parking,
off-street
yeah.
parking. You know, so what is it? Is it the utilities or, and I don't know the answer, but,
I think there's, in the sewered parts of the town, it's one issue, in the non-sewered parts, it's another issue. The lot size is a density control measure in non-sewered areas of the town, and there's a concern, generally speaking, the non-sewered areas of the town have larger lots, and I think there's a considerable concern in those areas of the town about increasing density. And the current controls are the Board of Health requirements and zoning.
Yep.
There's
That's right.
there's a concern in all parts of town
I think so.
Gary, I don't think you can say one part of town is more concerned about density increases than others. I mean, I think all people are concerned about that. Everybody's concerned about the impact of a accessory unit next to them and how it's...
No, I wasn't implying that, Sarah. I was just saying, just in terms of the configuration is less dense in the non-sewer areas of the town, that's all.
If anything, you could say that it's not as big an impact.
Right, 'cause they're further from their neighbors, yeah.
And so it's not an abutter issue as much because, they're larger lots.
I do want to also put on the record that just because a property is in a sewer district, they still would need to go to the sewer commission and make sure there's capacity.
Right, no, that's true.
So it shouldn't be just assumed that,
Yeah, Sue Sarney said this morning they would have to prove that it would work and pay a fee or pay some money.
there would be probably a betterment, but I know that there may be limited connections available in the Weir River District. So not all sewer districts are created equal.
Okay. All right, let's touch upon the next one, which is that the accessory dwelling unit shall only be, because this one has a couple things going on, only be permitted in a single-family dwelling for which a final certificate of occupancy was issued at least 2 years prior to an application for said permit. And if no such certificate was issued, which was legally occupied prior to such date.
Where are you?
This is 3, so the very bottom of the first page, 3B, at least on the draft I'm looking at.
That language came directly out of the Concord bylaw.
Okay.
Because of all the bylaws we read, we thought that said it the best.
It's similar to, it's not exactly the same as Concord.
Word for word, but I mean, it's as close a paraphrase.
Can you take bylaws word for word from other towns, Susan?
Yes,
You actually can.
absolutely.
It looked like we did have some word for word. and
No, there's no.
I just didn't know if there's plagiarism involved. and if you could get sued by the town of
You're on top
Concord.
of these things, Brett.
You have to do a footnote credit.
Nuance, just
Town of Concord takes town of Hingham to court.
No, there's no,
Okay,
no need to reinvent the wheel.
no.
I mean, the concern is just, and Gary mentioned this before, I mean, presumably Concord did all of this thinking about Concord and how Concord operates, right? So if there's no totally fine to borrow, it's just got to, work in the context
Well, and
of
to be
your
clear, what
town.
Concord said is the dwelling unit shall be located within the single-family dwelling as it existed 2 years prior to the date of application for the special permit.
Right.
That's probably a better way of saying it.
cleaner.
Right, I mean, I think what the
So
language...
you're saying you have to have lived in the house for a couple of years before
No, that the
you-
house has to have existed.
Okay.
For 2 years. Or, it's not that you can't have an addition on the house, it's just that it has to be in the part of the house that existed 2 years ago. So they're trying to avoid, my interpretation, additions for the purposes of
right.
creating the accessory unit. I think that's what Concord goes
Or
to.
to helping support it, I mean, right, so you could build an addition, put in some plumbing, and wait 2 years, and theoretically try to change it to a dwelling unit. Or we could have dwelling units in an existing structure, and then afterwards, somebody could come back for an addition to build another living room. I mean, staff has kind of talked about this provision, and we feel that there are workarounds that people are going to find. So
No matter what we do.
we would just say, what is the intent?
Right, what's the purpose?
Because otherwise you're making homeowners spend even more money doing a multiple permitting step process theoretically.
I don't know. I'm just, would not be surprised, let's put it that way, if there's so many more units that no one's even aware of. Because in the towns like Newton and Brookline and other communities that have large houses, particularly on large lots, a lot of them have live-in staff, whether it's au pairs or others.
Butlers.
And, they have these, and Hingham is becoming more and more that type of community, and you can see it in the size of the houses that are being built. So I guess the question is, again, this is just a question for the board.
Right.
If someone were to want to build a house and they've got a 2-acre lot and they want an au pair apartment, this is saying they can't build their new house with the au pair apartment there.
Right.
So, I mean, but Concord was clearly, as Gary pointed out in their language, trying to focus on people meeting the present needs to share, you know, the space of their existing home. And that's what Concord's is geared at. So, you know, it's, you gotta kind of just look at it by what you think is best for Hingham at this point in time.
Right.
Can you explain to me, Susan, how this bylaw is actually going to change the illegal apartments? I mean, you know?
Well, I think the only way it's gonna come up is, as Mary noted, when houses go to sell. Because if people create the illegal unit, when they go to sell it and list it with a broker, the first thing the broker says is, do you have a permit for that? So I think it's not gonna be people running in to get things permitted. I think it's gonna be over time, they'll find out they don't have to make it look like it's not really an accessory apartment, they can come in and get it permitted, or something will happen where, you know, the building department becomes aware of it and goes in. You get, you know.
Well, how does it play itself out if the broker, if the owner says, no, I don't have a permit for that?
So right now, when they come in and they talk to staff, staff will do some research and find out, is it grandfathered, is it existing or not? And if it's not, then our response is, we don't allow accessory dwelling units.
Why would if the broker knows it's a 1942 house, why would they even come in and talk to you?
A lot of brokers do due diligence, and they don't really know all the ins and outs. They want to market it.
Well, and they gotta market it, and if they market it as a two-family or a legal in-law and it's not, then the brokers have liability. I mean, it wasn't a residential case, but there was a big case in Norwell where, you know, a broker was found to have not properly, you know, represented and got whacked pretty hard. So, you know, the brokers do have a responsibility when they market a house to market it appropriately. So they can't call it a single family with a in-law if it's not a legal in-law.
Right. I will say, I mean, we met with Mike Clancy this morning, and when we asked him about enforcement, he said that, you know, when he gets a complaint, it gets dealt with. In other words.
Well, it does, but
I guess not all of them get complained about, right? Is that the issue? I mean.
That's correct. I mean, we don't have people running in here issuing complaints. We normally find them through other methods. And then they either need to deconstruct something or apply for a two-family conversion if they can.
I mean, you made it sound like something he's routinely addressing.
I think Mike deals with lots of stuff that the public is not.
There's a lot of situations. And
I guess I just didn't want everyone to think that, I didn't want anyone to think that the only enforcement was the brokers. That's all. I didn't. Well, it felt like we were talking about the brokers enforcing.
I defer to Chief.
How does he generally, so Mary, how does he generally deal with the violations? Does he warn the applicant and issue a fine?
So, you know, every situation is unique. So Michael does his due diligence and then researches the history and the permits, and then he proceeds as he feels is appropriate. I mean, we don't typically rush to fines, but normally there's a remedy, and that remedy might be eliminating the second structure. We had one at one location, which was in an accessory building, but basically he made them take it apart.
Yeah, that was a bad one.
Take the plumbing out. That was, and then they went back and put it back in.
The illegal septic system?
Yeah, but then they went and put it back in.
That was a bad one.
And then we had to go out a couple of years later and tell them to take it back out.
That was everything.
Now, that was not within the
for
structure,
anything.
right? That was, so I digress. But I mean, every situation is different, Bill. So Mike is very fair, I think.
Oh, yeah, he's very good. I was curious to see how he.
And reasonable.
Yeah. So I want to hear from the chief, and then I have to wrap this up.
The officers are very good when we go to calls. If we do something that doesn't appear to be done legitimately, we usually send over an email and ask for a problem.
Okay.
We're very good about working with the town board for all sorts of other reasons, so That's pretty commonplace if we run
It's another
into-
enforcement mechanism,
Yeah.
okay.
I mean, a lot of them, to be honest with you, are just like illegal tenants that are subleasing a bedroom or
Okay.
living in the basement, but that's generally how we get through them. So I know he does it quite often.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just share something? I have these notes from 2015. 1941 to 1954, allowed by right, two-family. 1955, two-family conversions were required. It also says by right, so I don't know what the difference is. 1962, two-family conversions required an approval. 1964, two-family conversions by special permit. And then in 1999, the bed and breakfast law adopted, so.
Yeah, so those are notes.
Those are those, yeah.
You're very organized,
Thank
you
you.
have those at your fingertips.
Right.
Thank
I
you.
Yeah, so
photocopy
it was
this
the
if you'd like.
60s. It was in the 60s
Yeah,
then.
1962, required approval.
Okay. Yes, Mary, what?
So are we going to talk about when we're going to continue this too?
Yes, we are. When are we going to continue this to? Do you have thoughts? I'm sure you do.
So I have a recommendation. You're doing marijuana on February 5th.
No,
Are they
okay,
doing
that
it?
sounds a little bit suspicious.
We're not.
My dark glasses and my hat.
We are definitely not.
The board has already continued the marijuana articles to February 5th.
Yep.
I'm not sure that you'll have time to tackle this at that meeting. You could continue it to that meeting just in case you have extra time. Another alternative is to consider adding a meeting February 14th and just focusing on this one topic. Otherwise, we start running into that same kind of scheduling
Right.
thing, because I have, February 5th is possibly a lighter agenda. February 12th, you have two pretty meaty projects. One could get bumped again, so if you continue this to the 5th, we can...
What else do we have on the 5th other than
The 5th,
marijuana?
you have a site plan and A3 for a new project. And then you have a subdivision. And then you have the marijuana
I'm away that
articles.
week.
Oh, yeah, you're away.
I'm away on the 5th,
And Bill's away.
but you can, if you guys want to
I
take it
mean,
up.
Bill said, does the board want to add a meeting February 14th?
Valentine's Day?
Yeah, I don't think so.
I have plans, no, I don't.
No comment.
Your wife's one.
Yeah, I know, exactly.
You're on TV. I think there's a recording.
Hi, Valentine's Day, you're on TV.
Absolutely not, yeah, I'm sure I'm busy right now.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, that's okay.
No, I'm
What are
with
the
you.
other options?
I'm with you.
Other than-
That trumps
I
the
don't think
planning
the 5th's
board.
going to work.
Okay, so
We've got a
if
lot
the
of work.
5th is not going to work, the 12th, I really, in all reality, looking at your agenda, I'm not sure that you're going to be able to do anything there, so you'd just be bumping it as a placeholder. So then
Next week is February break.
the next week is February vacation, and several of you are away, so then you're looking at February 26th. So unless you wanted to figure out,
Can we do, I mean,
the 15th,
Is that the Thursday?
the
if we
Thursday?
do another one that week, like if we do one on the 6th, Bill, you're out though, right?
Well, we have a meeting on the 6th with advisory. Jen and I have to go to advisory
Oh,
that
that's
night.
right.
I'm going to be at the
I knew-
ZBA
I
on
knew
the
it- I
6th.
knew
She
it
has
was a bad-
ZBA on the 6th, and we have advisory.
Right,
But you guys
sorry.
could do it.
You can do it without me, but
I mean, advisory, yeah, we don't know yet what time we'll be on advisory, so it's not like we could say we could do this.
Either 7:30 or 9:15.
Yeah.
I could do the 6th if you want, February 6th, yeah.
Yeah, no, that doesn't work.
That's the night we're
Doesn't
going to
work for you
advisory.
guys. No, that's right, doesn't work.
So the board could consider a Thursday meeting, the 8th, but that would be your third meeting that week. That's, or you could look at the week of the 12th,
Wait, I'm sorry, a Thursday meeting,
The 8th.
the 8th, but that makes 3 meetings that
You're
week.
still gone at that point?
And Bill's still away that week.
Yeah, I'm away that week.
So then you could look at the week of the 12th.
the 13th?
The 13th is a Tuesday, it's not preferable for Victor, but you've got the 13th or the 15th, a Tuesday or a Thursday.
I could do the 15th, but not the 13th.
I mean, I know advisory meets both nights, so I don't know, but I think Donna's
does
got ADUs.
How does that work? If we televise, does it help, or is it a real obstacle for you if we had a Tuesday or a Thursday?
If it's televised, it helps. Depending
depending on what else is on the agenda, advisory committee members kind of run in and out.
I mean, I'm loath to slip to the last week of February. I suspect that might cause you more consternation than a Tuesday or Thursday night meeting, right? If we start getting that late. Yeah, start,
So
I mean, that's late.
So you've got the 13th or the 15th or the 26th, and you've already got at least one application on the 26th.
What's the app on the 26th?
Okay.
I don't want to say,
Let's do the
Okay.
13th, because the
I'm just
15th,
I was trying to figure out how complex it would be.
how about Tuesday the 13th?
Riverstone's at 6:30, so I'm not sure, we're starting early because the ZBA has a big agenda that
is
night.
Thursday better?
So Thursday's better for me, but I could
do Thursday.
I could
I
just
could do
come late,
Thursday.
I could probably do, I could do 7:30
We don't
on the
we
13th.
leave Friday, but that's fine.
You're fine with Thursday?
Did someone, well, Gary said he couldn't do the 13th.
I can't do the 13th, I have a meeting on the 15th.
What about the 15th?
I could do the 15th.
Yeah. I'll
Sarah?
just-
I think so.
I'll just-
Thursday, the 15th, as far as I know.
Bill?
Sometimes
think
I
so.
have school meetings that
Honestly,
night.
when we get off on Monday nights, my
don't
schedule
always
gets a
know
little
them.
crazy.
Yeah, I know,
Because of my children, so I lock in Monday nights generally, but I think I can do that night.
I'll make the 15th work.
Let's plan for that.
So we'll continue, so the board wants to vote to continue this hearing to the,
Someone make a motion.
I'll make a motion to continue the accessory dwelling unit public hearing until Thursday, February 15th.
Second.
Any further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
all right, so we need our gavel.
Yep, motion to adjourn.